Chapter 765. It was precisely because of this mentality that they turned a blind eye to Luo Fan and thought that Luo Fan was just an insignificant weakling. As long as they could deal with Bai Yuan, they could do whatever they wanted with him. In fact, the reason why so many people had their eyes on Luo Fan and his group was because this view of Luo Fan was deeply ingrained in their hearts. Almost every creature that had not seen Luo Fan make a move with their own eyes thought so. Since Luo Fan was the young master of a large family clan and had come to the outer domain to gain experience, he must have a huge amount of wealth on him. Only then could he truly gain a foothold in the outer domain and stand out in the outer domain. The groups that had targeted Luo Fan and his group were after the wealth that Luo Fan might have on him. However, there was a fatal flaw that they had overlooked, whether intentionally or unintentionally. If Luo Fan was really the young master of a large family clan who had come to the outer domain to gain experience, how could the person protecting him be a mere second-stage immortal? It must be known that a second-stage immortal in the inner domain was not much stronger than a first-stage immortal in the outer domain. On the other hand, there were thousands of times more rank 1 immortals in the outer region. Under such circumstances, if a rank 2 immortal had to protect a living being that was not even a rank 2 immortal, let alone stand out, it would be a huge problem for the rank 2 immortal to survive. This was why wealth could move people's hearts. Most people would not think that a fat sheep walking in front of them was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Luo Fan naturally did not know that he had already been recognized as a young master from a large family clan. His imagination was not that rich. But no matter what, the current situation was already very clear. The other party did not take him seriously and instead focused on dealing with Bai Yuan. This kind of situation was naturally the best for him. In any case, he also had the intention to let Bai Yuan train and see if he could awaken the talent hidden deep within his body. Since the other party had targeted Bai Yuan, it was naturally to his liking. Therefore, Luo Fan retracted his aura and made his presence as small as possible. With Luo Fan's cultivation, it was as easy as flipping his hand to conceal his presence from a first or second level immortal. Thus, perhaps the besieging immortals had subconsciously overlooked Luo Fan in the beginning. But now, it was likely impossible for them to find Luo Fan even if they wanted to. Impossible. I've cultivated for tens of millions of years. How could I be defeated so easily? Bai Yuan's pride finally allowed him to refocus his mind. He gathered the blazing white flames that were scattered all over the place and gathered them in front of him. The flames condensed into 6 flaming arms on his body and combined with his real arms, forming 8 arms. He transformed into the form of an 8-armed ape that was similar to his original body. The arms formed by the flames were not illusory at all. They were like real arms made of flesh and blood. The formation of these arms instantly allowed Bai Yuan to gather his thoughts, allowing him to recover from the oppressive aura. He finally calmed down and looked at the young man angrily. A second stage immortal after tens of millions of years? Ha ha! At this moment, the second stage immortal could not help but laugh loudly. His laughter was filled with disdain and vicissitudes of life. There was even a hint of deeply hidden envy in it. After laughing for a long time, the young man stopped and said with an indescribable expression, "In the outer region, if you can't become a first-stage immortal within 10,000 years and a second-stage immortal within 100,000 years, you'll only be a corpse." As he spoke, the people around him also revealed indescribable expressions. It was as if they were reminiscing and vicissitudes of life. It was as if they had experienced countless tragedies. Looks like life in the outer region is indeed cruel. Even Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly. The inexplicable expressions on their faces were extremely rich in meaning. Luo Fan only needed to look at them to know what kind of thoughts they had in their minds when they said those words. Living beings like them who sought survival in the outer region could only cultivate with everything they had because of the pressure of life. They even had to accelerate their cultivation by 10 times or even 100 times to obtain the right to survive. On the other hand, living beings in the inner region could be so carefree. They could cultivate if they wanted to and relax if they didn't want to. They did not even need to consider how to fight or how to obtain the right to survive. This was like the difference between heaven and earth. Even an outsider would sigh with emotion, let alone the immortals who lived in the inner region. It's no wonder that they're so hostile to the creatures that come from the inner domain. This is no different from people hating the rich in my previous life. Luo Fan finally made a conclusion. Bai Yuan obviously did not feel this way. To him, it was not his fault that he was born in the inner region. Even after hearing about their lives in the outer region, he was not too moved. On the contrary, he felt a little dissatisfied that they could cultivate to become second-stage immortals so quickly. Why? Why did they cultivate to become second-stage immortals in less than 100,000 years, while I cultivated bitterly for tens of millions of years and barely reached the second stage? Moreover, I had to sell myself as a slave. Now, I don't even know if I have the chance to return home to cultivate this innate Tao aptitude. He roared in his heart. This kind of anger was unprecedented in his entire life of cultivation. It was so intense that it even covered his eyes. Everything he saw seemed to be separated by a layer of flames, becoming extremely distorted and illusory. Even the sound of his heartbeat kept increasing due to this anger. The contraction and contraction of his heartbeat kept increasing. In a trance, he could only hear the loud thump, thump, thump sound of his heartbeat. This sound was so intense that it was enough to completely cover all the sounds in the outside world. He could only see the mouth of the person opposite him opening and closing, but he could not hear what they were saying at all. And this made him even angrier. Bai Yuan had spent most of his life living on a mountain peak that was more than 3 million meters tall. Even if there were occasional battles, they were like child's play in the eyes of the outer region cultivators. Naturally, this kind of battle would not cause too much anger. Thus, he had never been more angry than he was right now in his life. This kind of anger seemed to have broken through a certain limit, gradually causing some kind of inexplicable change in his body. This kind of change was incomparably unfamiliar to him. It was something he had never thought of before. However, to Luo Fan, this kind of change was something he had been looking forward to for a long time. It was the main reason why he had brought Bai Yuan with him. It's finally appeared. Looks like I really need to experience a bit more in order to trigger my potential, thought Luo Fan. At this moment, the change in Bai Yuan's body finally broke through the layers of barriers and truly appeared. A flame suddenly flashed in his heart. This flame was formless, colorless, and lightless. It was as if it did not exist at all. Once it appeared, it instantly wrapped around Bai Yuan's entire heart and began to crazily demand power from the outside world. It madly absorbed all the power from the outside world into it. The power that approached this flame was clearly the power in Bai Yuan's body. In an instant, the power in Bai Yuan's body frantically poured into the invisible, colorless flame. As this power poured in, the flame seemed to have been doused with kerosene. It instantly swelled and began to spread out of his heart, spreading to every part of his body. The 6 arms formed by the blazing white flame that he had sent out collapsed in an instant. They turned back into flames and poured back into his body. They also poured into the flame that had appeared in his heart. The flames that had been sent out of his body had originally been sent out by Bai Yuan in a fit of rage. However, they had taken up almost all of the power in his body. Compared to the flames that had been absorbed by the previous flame, the flames that belonged to his body were many times more numerous. As these flames poured in, the flame instantly swelled by an unknown number of times. In the blink of an eye, it had engulfed every inch of his body. It even manifested on the outside and completely enveloped his body. This flame was invisible, colorless. However, it was not undetectable. This was because when the flame appeared, it burned everything in its surroundings. Countless types of acquired origin energy, baleful energy, and stellar essence were violently burned by the flame and transformed. This kind of burning and transformation caused the line of sight of him to be intensely distorted. As a result, his body seemed to become illusory. This kind of transformation could only appear when the temperature was extremely high. From the range of the transformation, it was obvious that his body was wrapped in a layer of flames. The moment the invisible, colorless, and colorless flame appeared in Ba Yuan's heart, he suddenly felt as if his soul had instantly detached from his body. Everything he saw and thought became incomparably clear and comprehensible. The anger that had previously been enough to burn his soul was still present. In fact, it was even more intense than before. However, it could no longer affect his calm. He seemed to have become another person. Hovering high above his head, he quietly watched the changes happening to his body below him. He quietly watched the astonished expressions on the faces of the immortals surrounding him. Of course, Luo Fan, who had concealed his presence, was still ignored by him at this time. His cultivation was far, far away from the current Luo Fan. Even though he had stimulated his own talent and his strength and temperament had skyrocketed, he still couldn't reach the low threshold of being able to detect Luo Fan. The concealed Luo Fan still didn't exist to him. Although he felt as if something was missing, his attention was quickly attracted by the changes in his body. He set aside the feeling of not being able to detect Luo Fan. So, I still have such great power in my body. If I had known earlier, why would I have needed tens of millions of years to become a second-stage immortal? Ba Yuan's transcendent body and transcendent will thought to himself. At this moment, all the power in his body had fused into the formless, colorless, and colorless flame. His body had become empty, as if it had become a huge hole that was waiting to be filled with boundless energy. Although it was so empty, he felt that the bottleneck that had shackled him for tens of thousands of years had completely disappeared. It was as if as long as he had enough energy, he could instantly push his cultivation to an unfathomable level, a supreme level that he had dreamed of. When this feeling appeared, he finally realized that the moment he stimulated the power in his body, he had broken through the bottleneck between the second stage and the third stage of the immortal realm. He had finally reached the third stage of the immortal realm. This realization made him feel indescribable joy amidst his boundless anger. This kind of joy didn't reduce the intensity of the anger. Instead, it intertwined with the anger, forming a strange combination that increased the anger's vitality. It made the anger even hotter, stronger, and more powerful. The flame seemed to have been born out of anger. As his anger changed, the flame also became hotter and more intense. The other power of the flame had yet to be seen, but its ability to refine the body was unimaginably powerful. As the flame burned, Ba Yuan felt his body strengthen at an unimaginable speed. Countless impurities were burned into nothingness by the flame. His body became denser and denser, and he even felt like he was gradually shrinking. One time, 2 times, 3 times, in just a few breaths, his body had strengthened to more than 10 times his original size. Moreover, it didn't stop there. It continued to strengthen within the flame, transforming towards an unimaginable level. At this moment, the surrounding first and second stage immortals finally realized that something was wrong. They didn't need to call out to each other and attacked. Their attacks were not like what Ba Yuan had done before, where he blasted out all of his power to attack his opponent. Instead, they used their own power like fishing, drawing out the power of the void outside, the power of the great Tianyuan world, the rules, laws, and even the power of the great Tao, and using an almost irresistible method to attack their opponent. Using this method to attack, a portion of power could display power that was 100 times greater than one's own power. With such power, it was no wonder that they looked down on Ba Yuan, who only knew how to use his power roughly. In an instant, the entire void was shrouded by an endless, tyrannical power. Unimaginable power blasted towards Ba Yuan from all directions. These powers were unimaginably powerful. Almost every single one of them had reached the level of a third stage immortal. Furthermore, there was an extremely tight connection between these energies. They complemented each other, constantly circulating, constantly changing, constantly exchanging, constantly rotating, and greatly increasing the cohesion between them. From another angle, it also strengthened the might of the bombardment of these energies. If these powers had appeared a few breaths earlier, they would definitely have been able to destroy Ba Yuan before his innate power was activated. However, it was too late now. Ba Yuan had already broken through the shackles of a second-stage immortal and reached the realm that only third-stage immortals could reach. These powers were terrifying powers that he couldn't resist before, but to him now, they were nourishment that he coveted. They replenished his power and filled up the emptiness in his body. In an instant, the flames around Ba Yuan's body trembled and formed into 8 invisible flaming arms. As if they were hugging the world, they instantly hugged the countless terrifying attacks that were coming at him from all directions. Their structures were incomparably exquisite, and they had unleashed all sorts of destructive powers to the limit. These powers contained the powerful attacking wills of the 6 immortals. Normally, they could be destroyed by others, but it was almost impossible for others to take them away or absorb them. However, what these powers encountered this time was a formless, colorless flame. It was a flame born from anger and hidden deep within Ba Yuan's body. This flame had an unimaginable ability to contain and refine. Once it appeared, it completely devoured all the power in Ba Yuan's body. Naturally, it also had an unimaginable ability to refine external powers. When the boundless powers attacking him from all directions collided with the 8 formless, colorless flames, they were instantly refined in large swathes. The powerful attack wills of the 6 immortals were burned away. The impurities in the power were removed by the flames and completely absorbed into the flames. The flames continued to grow, and the feeling of emptiness in Ba Yuan's body continued to fade. This change completely exceeded the expectations of the 6 first and second stage immortals. They instantly had a bad feeling. They were extremely experienced in battle, so they didn't need to discuss with each other before they each made a decision. In an instant, a magic treasure emerged from each of their bodies. The magic treasure that emerged from the man who spoke first was a bronze bell. It was 3 feet tall and looked extremely simple. The aura it gave off was the aura of a third-stage magic treasure. The woman beside him was also the strongest among the 6, a stage 2 immortal. The magic treasure that had rushed out of her body was a green jade hairpin. It also had a powerful aura, but it was only a stage 2 magic treasure. It was far inferior to the man. The other magic treasures that emerged from their bodies were blades, swords, seals, and a bronze mirror. However, their magic treasures were only first-stage magic treasures. They could barely be considered magic treasures. After these magic treasures appeared, they directly activated them, causing the power of the magic treasures to erupt. They wrapped up the power of the outside world, which was more than 1,000 times stronger than what they could control, and together, they attacked Ba Yuan at an unimaginable speed. However, he did not care about anything else. He used the strongest power he could unleash to wipe out Ba Yuan, who was getting more and more dangerous. To be continued. Chapter 766. Although Luo Fan seemed to be able to refine magic treasures with a wave of his hand, and the magic treasure he had refined earlier was said to be equivalent to a Tier 2 magic treasure, but it could be obtained with only 10 Tier 3 celestial techniques. There were many magic treasures. In fact, magic treasures were extremely precious to all cultivators in the great heaven primordial world. This was especially true for the cultivators who were struggling to survive in the outer realms. After all, refining a magic treasure successfully, no matter what method was used, would require a lot of time and effort, and it might even affect one's cultivation. Moreover, once a magic treasure was refined, it would have an extremely close connection with the cultivator. Although it was not inseparable, it was still connected to the cultivator's heart, and they would definitely be quite reluctant to trade it away. Therefore, although it was generally accepted that 10 high-grade celestial techniques could be exchanged for a magic treasure, very few cultivators would really exchange a magic treasure for 10 high-grade celestial techniques unless they had no other choice. In other words, this generally accepted price was just a price used to measure the value of a magic treasure. For example, A magic treasure with 72 restrictions like what Luo Fan had encountered before was worth as much as a Tier 2 magic treasure. It could be traded at this generally accepted price. That was all there was to the value of the price. At that moment, each of the 6 Tier 1 and Tier 2 immortals had a magic treasure, and a magic treasure of the leading immortal was even a level higher than his own cultivation. This was enough to show that this organization either had a strong backer or they were quite capable of robbing people. However, based on their current behavior, the latter was more likely to be the case. After all, they had only seen Bai Yuan's ability to threaten them, yet they had instantly used their final and strongest attack, an attack from a magic treasure. This was enough to show how cautious they were. Normally, beings with powerful backers wouldn't be this cautious. These magic treasures all had different functions, but it was clear that they had already communicated and planned when choosing or refining their magic treasures. Thus, once these magic treasures were released, they naturally formed a strange array in the void, with the Tier 3 magic treasure as the core and the other magic treasures as supplements. They formed an extremely exquisite array, and the power they had drawn was thousands of times stronger than the power possessed by the 6 immortals. According to some strange method, the power turned into a clear, transparent, and incomparably pure brilliance. With a momentum that could break through the void, it followed some kind of law and broke through all obstacles, blasting towards Bai Yuan. This power seemed to be just a crude bombardment. In fact, it contained endless ingenuity. As it meandered in the void, it had an unimaginable ability to break through it. If it was just an ordinary power with powerful defensive abilities that wrapped around Bai Yuan, then under the impact of this power, he definitely wouldn't be able to defend himself for even an instant. The 6 magic treasures and the power they carried would immediately break through, and all the power would pour into Bai Yuan's body. However, clearly, the invisible and intangible flame that enveloped Bai Yuan was not just an ordinary power, nor was it an ordinary flame. It could burn everything. The mysterious heart fire that could refine and contain everything. This kind of flame didn't use toughness to defend against external power. Instead, it directly burned and refined everything. Its all-encompassing power was unleashed to the extreme, completely containing and refining all the power within its range. Under these circumstances, although the 6 magic treasures and the power they carried were extremely mysterious and contained enough power to blast through all obstacles, they were unable to display much effect in the face of the heart fire. In an instant, the 8 arms formed by the 8 primordial heart fire hugged the 6 magic treasures and the boundless power that they carried. It directly began to burn and refine the nearly infinite power, removing the impurities in the power and absorbing the essence of the power into its own body, making the heart fire burn even more vigorously. The exuberance of the heart fire made its refining ability even more powerful. This, in turn, sped up the heart fire's refining process. At this time, the 6 immortals' expressions finally changed drastically. Although the power was condensed from the magic treasures, it also contained their wills. It could even be said to be an extension of their wills. Every bit of power was connected to their minds. Any bit of loss would be directly reflected in their minds. Under these circumstances, when the power was refined by Bai Yuan, it was as if a force was constantly tugging at their minds. They constantly felt that the power was being converted into Bai Yuan's. Bai Yuan was growing stronger with every passing moment, while they were weakening with every passing moment. Oh no, what kind of flame is this? Why is it so strange? This thought flashed through the leading immortal's mind. This was the first time they had encountered such a situation, but they could no longer work together without speaking like before. Thus, they could only look at each other and exchange their thoughts. Only then did they come up with an idea and know what to do. However, by the time they had come up with an idea, it was already too late. The 6 of them instantly felt an indescribable pain from the depths of their souls. It was as if an extremely important part of their bodies had been forcibly cut away. They suddenly felt as if they had completely lost their most precious thing. Along with this feeling came a few incomparably mournful howls from the front. In an instant, they all felt an indescribable pain and regret. My magic treasure is finished. At the location of the 8 yuan treasure, the formless and lightless arm of flames that had expanded by who knows how many times had completely refined the surrounding energy, directly wrapping around the treasure. The heart fire was extremely mysterious. It could even burn through wills and thoughts. The connection between the 6 immortals and the magic treasure had already been severed the moment Bai Yuan's heart fire wrapped around it. It was precisely because of this that the few of them felt this incomparably painful sensation. As for the magic treasures, they already had a little bit of intelligence. With their connection to their masters severed, they instantly knew that their fate of destruction was imminent. Thus, they let out miserable howls that made the 6 immortals feel pain and regret. These howls came from the source of their spirit. There was no concealment or embellishment, and they directly transmitted their thoughts of extreme pain. They could reach the depths of any living being's soul and cause any living being who heard these howls to feel compassion. However, to Bai Yuan, this couldn't sway his will at all. Or rather, they couldn't truly influence his decision. Although his body felt some compassion from the howls and felt some sympathy for the magic treasure spirits, his will had transcended his body and the influence of these emotions. However, his body's will had transcended beyond his body and the influence of these emotions. He directly controlled everything from a higher point of view and naturally eliminated these influences. He controlled the fire of his heart and continued to charge towards those treasures in an indomitable manner, burning them. Magic treasures were a combination of matter and energy. Compared to pure power, they were much more difficult to refine. As a result, although 8 Yuan's mental strength continued to gain results in the refinement of the magic treasure, and the emptiness in his body became smaller and smaller due to the constant replenishment, the magic treasure spirit did not disappear. It continued to wail miserably. In fact, the rank 2 and rank 3 magic treasures were still struggling madly in the process of being burned. As they were burned, they continuously charged at the heart fire in an attempt to escape. However, it was clear that the 2 magic treasure struggles weren't very fruitful. Bai Yuan's heart fire could even cut off the connection between the magic treasures controlled by the 6 immortals. He directly began to refine them. At this time, these magic treasures only had a little bit of intelligence. They didn't even have the ability to think. How could they effectively struggle free? The 8 arms formed from the heart fire used all sorts of exquisite techniques to dispel the magic treasure's struggling power. No matter how the magic treasures struggled, they couldn't escape the heart fire's embrace. They couldn't escape and could only wait for their fate of being refined bit by bit. The energy that magic treasures possessed was not something that could be compared to pure power. He only refined a small portion of the magic treasures. He didn't even completely erase their spirits. Bai Yuan felt that the emptiness in his body had completely disappeared. What replaced it was a faint feeling of fullness that welled up in his heart. This feeling of fullness wasn't strong, but it made Bai Yuan instantly understand that his accumulation of energy had reached a limit. With one more step, he could truly break through the shackles and step into the 3rd level of the immortal realm. He could feel the existence of this limit. He couldn't help but be overjoyed. The heart fire burned fiercely, and his ability to refine the 6 magic treasures instantly increased by 10 times. A wave of energy that was 10 times faster than before was instantly absorbed into the heart fire, creating a powerful force. In an instant, his heart fire gained some kind of invisible power. In an instant, it soared and finally broke through the invisible barrier. It made him feel as if the entire world had suddenly stopped moving. It was as if time had stopped at this moment. It was as if the entire world had stopped moving at this moment. In an instant, an endless number of lines appeared in front of his eyes. These lines had infinite colors. Every one of them was meandering and moving, as if they were sketching something, as if they were controlling something. In a trance, Bai Yuan understood what these lines were. They were the laws. They were the mysterious existences formed by the supreme big tools. Understanding this, he suddenly felt that he had a deeper understanding of many of the techniques that he had cultivated in the past. There was even a feeling of shame that surged in his heart. The way I used my power in the past was really too crude, too simple, too wasteful. Such a thought appeared in his mind. However, this thought only flashed by. He knew that this current state could only appear in the instant of a breakthrough. It was a rare state to comprehend the laws, and even the hidden Tao behind them. If he wasted this period of time lamenting and missed this opportunity, he didn't know how long it would take for him to comprehend this state again. Thus, he used all his effort to comprehend the endless laws. He worked hard to engrave all kinds of mysteries into the depths of his memory. This state was, after all, a state that could only be obtained in the instant of a breakthrough. It could only last for an extremely short period of time. Even though Ba Yuan used all his effort to recall, memorize, and comprehend, in the end he only managed to comprehend a few laws before leaving that state. The world before his eyes returned to normal. Time began to flow again. The scenery around him returned to normal. At this moment, the heart fire in his body was no longer full. However, it was no longer empty. Instead, it was a very comfortable and very satisfied feeling. This feeling was so wonderful to him. However, it didn't make him feel much joy, because he had just left an even more wonderful feeling. The feeling of being so close to the Tao that he had never felt before. This sense of defeat directly suppressed the joy he was feeling now, and even made him a little irritated. This kind of irritation, naturally, had to be vented. Thus, even though he no longer needed to refine power to replenish himself, he still urged his heart fire to continue refining the 6 magic treasures. He wanted to completely refine the 6 magic treasures to vent his irritation. At this moment, Luo Fan, who had been watching from the side for a long time, finally made his move. With a casual wave of his hand, an untraceable and irresistible force appeared out of thin air, directly acting on the 6 magic treasures that had been mostly refined, as well as the heart fire that enveloped the 6 magic treasures. In an instant, the connection between the heart fire, the magic treasures, and Ba Yuan was completely cut off, directly breaking away from Ba Yuan's control. With a slight sinking, he arrived in front of Luo Fan. It was also at this moment that Ba Yuan remembered Luo Fan, who had been standing by his side. He remembered his current identity. His expression kept changing. He seemed to want to fight back, but he also seemed to be afraid and worried. After a long while, he finally calmed down and regained his previous respect and cautiousness. At this moment, he had already thought it through. Even though he had become a 3rd stage immortal and seemed to be more than 100 times stronger than before, he still had no ability to resist his master, Luo Fan. The gap between the two of them had not been reduced at all. This was something that could be easily seen from his master's one move. His heart fire was completely out of his control, and he could easily see it. At this moment, the surrounding immortals also reacted. They looked at each other and directly dispersed the space-time they had constructed. As the space-time dispersed, the surrounding void instantly changed. The space gradually collapsed. In the blink of an eye, the few of them, Luo Fan and Ba Yuan, reappeared in the alley. After appearing in the alley, they didn't need to discuss anything. They directly went in front of Luo Fan and carefully bowed to Luo Fan. They said, "We were rash and offended you, Exalted Immortal. Please forgive us. As long as Exalted Immortal is willing to spare us, we are willing to pay anything in exchange." At this moment, how could they not know that their previous guesses about Luo Fan were extremely ridiculous? This person in front of them was not some young master of a large family clan. He was clearly a 5th stage immortal at the very least. He was at least hundreds of thousands or even millions of times stronger than Ba Yuan. The reason why he didn't reveal any aura and why they couldn't sense his presence was not because of any magic tools or magic treasures, but because his strength was already at least 3 stages higher than theirs. Being 3 levels stronger was already a natural chasm, a gap that no other methods could overcome. Even if they were as confident in their abilities to use their strength as before, they still didn't believe that these techniques could allow them to defeat an opponent 3 levels higher than them. Moreover, after experiencing such a drastic change with Bai Yuan, their confidence in their techniques was no longer as strong as before. It was even more impossible for them to believe that they could defeat an immortal 3 stages higher than them. Therefore, they knew very well that if this person wanted to, not to mention the fact that there were only 6 people on their side, even if there were 60 or 600 people on their side, it would only be a matter of time for him to crush them. It was precisely because they understood this that they directly followed their past experiences and didn't dare to have any other thoughts. They directly admitted defeat and begged for mercy. The outer area was completely different from the inner area. It was almost like 2 completely different worlds. This difference was not only reflected in the living conditions of cultivators, but also reflected in the way they viewed things. In the inner area, because of the existence of sages, all living beings had to abide by certain unwritten rules. Therefore, even if there was irreconcilable hatred, even if there was malice that could not abate after torturing the other party for hundreds of millions of years, the fate of the losing party would not be too miserable. Even if it was miserable, there was a limit. They would not break the rules set by the sages. Once they broke the rules, they would naturally be rejected by the sages in the inner area, unable to establish a foothold in the inner area. Of course, this was naturally not done by the sages, nor was it automatically rejected by the inner area. It was a kind of unwitting change. Needless to say, he was not the only one. On the other hand, the outer lands are different. There was no absolute power in the outer lands that could intimidate all living beings and set rules that everyone had to abide by. As a result, there was no bottom line for the loser. As long as the winner was willing, there would be no negative consequences, even if they used all the cruelest methods they could think of to torture their opponent. If the loser in the outer area did not have the self-awareness to admit defeat and beg for mercy, then what awaited them might be an unimaginably miserable fate. The immortals couldn't be any more aware of this difference. Therefore, they did not feel the slightest bit ashamed of their performance, nor did they feel that it was shameful. At this moment, Luo Fan did not care about them. He brought Bai Yuan with him to study the innate gift hidden in Bai Yuan's body. At this moment, his innate gift had already been activated and was in his hands. Why would he pay attention to these insignificant 1st and 2nd stage immortals? Instead, he focused all his attention on the heart flame in his hand. Chapter 767. This heart fire was born from anger, and its source was the soul. It was an extremely idealistic flame. Its form of existence coincided with some sort of mysterious law. It was faintly discernible, and in essence, it was not even a real flame. It merely displayed the form of a flame, so it was called a flame. Luo Fan touched the heart fire and carefully sensed its nature, analyzing every bit of its essence. The heart could contain everything, abandon everything, and swallow everything. Thus, this heart fire could also contain everything, refine everything, and swallow everything. After carefully analyzing the heart fire, Luo Fan finally discovered that from an inseparable point of view, the composition of the heart fire was extremely mysterious and complicated. Even at his current level, it was extremely difficult for him to analyze it. It was a structure that was almost impossible to analyze. The structure was a series of strange symbols. These symbols did not seem special at first glance, but if one were to carefully examine them, they would discover that these symbols faintly communicated with the Great Tao. It was almost like a manifestation of the Great Tao. This manifestation was even more complete than the threads that represented the laws that Bai Yuan had seen before. It was closer to the origin of the Great Tao. Suddenly, Luo Fan understood where Bai Yuan's talent came from. I see. He is a descendant left behind by an existence at the peak of the golden path of the Daoyuo. That's why he has inherited this talent. As he thought to himself, he could not help but reveal a look of pity. That existence clearly had not become a saint. If he had become a saint, his descendants would not have been reduced to staying on that mountain for tens of millions of years before becoming second-stage immortals. His innate ability wouldn't just be as powerful as it was now. It must be known that a saint-level existence was almost omnipotent. Even if his power was somewhat limited in the Great Tianyuan world due to various conditions, the bit of talent he left behind, if it was still the heart fire, would have been enough to advance by Yuan 2 or 3 levels upon awakening. As for how powerful a saint was, Luo Fan could not be more clear. Just a projection of his thoughts was enough to have power close to that of a saint. One could only imagine how strong the inheritance of power was. After sighing, Luo Fan threw all of this to the back of his mind and carefully memorized the strange symbols. He tried hard to copy the structure in the depths of his memory. If he wanted to analyze and comprehend, with Luo Fan's current cultivation realm, it was still not enough. But just memorizing was not a problem for him. Thus, very quickly, Luo Fan had already learned all the details of this structure. Even the pattern of his transformation was completely recorded in his memory, and he would never forget it again. After doing all this, he casually waved his hand. The heart fire trembled and broke away from the 6 magic treasures. It flew back and directly entered Bai Yuan's body, coming back under his control. After obtaining this bit of heart fire, Bai Yuan's expression relaxed. The heart fire was born from his soul. Losing even a little bit of it was like digging something out of his heart. Now that he was able to retract the heart fire, even if it did not have much effect on him in terms of quantity, it was enough for him to show such an expression. After sending the heart fire back, Luo Fan started to look at the 6 magic treasures. He saw that the 6 magic treasures had all suffered great damage. The 3rd level magic treasure devolved to the 2nd level. The 2nd level magic treasure devolved to the 1st level, and the remaining 4 1st level magic treasures devolved to the point where they could barely maintain the level of magic treasures. They also seemed like they could collapse and devolve into magic treasures at any time. Compared to before, their power was countless times weaker. The moment the 6 magic treasures left the heart fire, they naturally re-established their connection with their owners. The immortals also instantly understood how much damage their magic treasures had suffered. Their hearts ached so much that tears almost rolled down their cheeks. To refine the magic treasure to this state, every one of them had expended an immeasurable amount of energy. Countless materials, a huge amount of energy, and even their own cultivation had been affected by the refining of this magic treasure. Right now, in such a short period of time, tens of thousands of years of hard work had gone up in smoke. This was like a huge chunk of flesh being forcefully cut out of their hearts. How painful was that? It was easy to imagine. However, despite their heartache, they didn't dare activate the magic treasures to retract them. Instead, they didn't even dare to show their heartache. They quietly waited for Luo Fan's decision. Luo Fan examined the 8 magic treasures and savored them for a moment. He knew that these magic treasures were useless to him. There wasn't even a possibility of him gaining anything from them. There weren't any strange ideas that could make his eyes light up, so he lost interest in them. With a wave of his hand, the magic treasures flew back to their respective owners. The immortals were overjoyed to see this and hurriedly withdrew the magic treasures back into their bodies. They used their own strength, their own blood essence, and their own souls to nurture their magic treasures. Although the magic treasures had already suffered great damage, they were still the ones who'd refined them. If they wanted to refine them back to their original state, it would be 100 times easier than refining a new magic treasure. Although it would also take a long time and consume a lot of blood essence and energy, it was still a blessing in disguise. When Luo Fan saw them withdraw their magic treasures, he said, "I still need a few more slaves. Since you're willing to give up everything, then be my slaves for 3,000 years as well." There was no twist or leeway in his words. This was clearly the final decision. Being slaves for 3,000 years was far more generous than these immortals had imagined. They couldn't muster up any thoughts of resistance and immediately bowed to Luo Fan, formalizing their master-servant relationship. The outer realm was a cruel world. It was rare for someone to become a slave after losing a battle. Under normal circumstances, defeat meant death. Even their souls would be refined into magic treasures and turned into their opponent's cultivation power. But now, Luo Fan was willing to take them as slaves for only 3,000 years. This kind of generosity made them feel that their luck wasn't too bad. As a result, they felt much more relaxed. Luo Fan asked a little and found out that these people didn't have any backers. The 6 of them formed a group that relied on robbing and robbing for a living. This kind of group was the most common in the outer realm. Of course, they claimed to be an adventurer group that formed in order to have a stronger survival ability outside the city. This group had a moderate name in the southern wilderness. It was called the Zhong Hairpin Group. It was named after the Dharma treasures of the 2 second-stage immortals. The male second-stage immortal was called Zhou Si, and the female second-stage immortal was called Xinai. The other first-stage immortals were Dian Cheng, Qi Yao, Lu Go, and Sheng Zhuang. Of course, these lives looked very similar to the primordial world, but it wasn't true that their names were written like that. In fact, the reason why they were written like the names of the primordial world was because Luo Fan had forcefully translated them. In fact, if their names were written in the language of the Tianyuan world, they would not look like that. However, it didn't matter. Anyway, the name was just a title. As long as they knew each other, it didn't matter how they were written. After learning the necessary information, Luo Fan asked, Zhou Si, does your Zhong Hairpin group have a base in the southern wilderness? Master, although our group is useless, we have a residence in the east of the city as a base. If Master doesn't mind, you can go and live there, Zhou Si said respectfully. He was more knowledgeable than Bai Yuan. Naturally, he knew how to be a slave. At this moment, his expression and attitude were very humble, which was very in line with his identity as a slave. Luo Fan smiled slightly and said, That's right. He said, That's right, it will save me a lot of money to buy a place to stay. It's my honor to be able to save Master's expense, Zhou Si said obsequiously. Bai Yuan didn't know what to say at this time. He was the first slave that Luo Fan had accepted. Previously, he also thought that he had done a very good job and was very appropriate. But now, he realized that to be a slave, he had to do this. He was still too naive and couldn't put down his pride. For a moment, he was filled with emotions. At the moment, Zhou Si and the others led the way in front, taking Luo Fan and Bai Yuan to the east of the southern wilderness city. This speed was still neither fast nor slow. Moreover, they were only walking on the ground and didn't use any magical power to escape. While walking, Zhou Si seemed to know that Luo Fan wasn't familiar with the southern wilderness, so along the way, he talked nonstop to Luo Fan about all kinds of things he had seen on the road. Those kinds of introductions were on the way to the Myriad Weapon Pavilion. Luo Fan had heard the old man's introduction once, but Zhou Si's introduction was completely different from the old man's, and the angle he took was also completely different. The old man's introduction was completely based on the history of the various buildings in the city, and introduced the culture that the buildings represented. But Zhou Si's introduction was based on the history of the so-called adventure group. He introduced to Luo Fan when and what kind of battle took place in the building, why the battle was triggered, what the outcome of the battle was, and what kind of changes the situation in the southern wilderness city had in the end. With his narration, Luo Fan gradually learned about the so-called adventurer group's living conditions in this city, and faintly had some new understanding of the form of civilization in the outer wilderness. The east of the city was quite far from that alley. They walked unhurriedly all the way. Although their speed couldn't be considered slow, they still walked for several hours until the sky gradually darkened. Only then did they arrive at the residence of the Zhong Hairpin Troop. This place looked like a very ordinary residence. Occupying a radius of several thousand feet, it was completely a medium-sized manor. The great Tianyuan world was really too vast. Even if there were countless creatures living in it, the land was vast and the population was sparse. Therefore, generally, the residence wouldn't be too small, and it wouldn't be like the one on Earth in Luo Fan's previous life, where one had to spend one's entire family fortune to obtain a piece of land. This manor that occupied a radius of several thousand feet did not seem to be the largest in the surroundings. It could barely be considered as medium. This medium residence was extremely inconspicuous in the surrounding densely packed residences. There wasn't anything special about it, making it difficult for people to pay attention to it. Not bad. The choice of location is quite good. Luo Fan looked at the residence and smiled. Thank you for your praise, master. Josie seemed to be very happy as he said. Although he was behaving like this, Xi and AI and the others around him didn't have any strange reactions. It seemed that their expressions were still the same as before. Obviously, they didn't feel that there was anything wrong with Josie's behavior, or perhaps they also felt that this was the normal behavior and the way to survive. And this was even more of an eye-opener for Ba Yuan. As they spoke, they had already entered the residence's main gate. As soon as they entered, they saw many mechanical puppets standing still. These mechanical puppets seemed to have sensed their arrival the moment they entered. They immediately began to move and began to make all kinds of preparations to serve Luo Fan and the others, welcoming them to be able to enjoy life in this residence in the most comfortable manner. After being busy for a while, they finally settled down. At this time, Luo Fan was already sitting on the main seat of the hall. He looked at the few people standing below him in a relaxed manner. He chuckled and said, I won't stay in the Southern Barbarian for a long time. At most, I'll leave after a few months. If you have anything to deal with, take advantage of these few months to deal with it quickly. Don't be flustered. As a local tyrant who had stayed in Nanman for a long time, Luo Fan understood that Zhou Si and the others must have all kinds of messy relationships in Nanman. These relationships were the fetters between them and Nanman. If he just let them cut off these fetters and leave, they would probably be dissatisfied. At that time, he was afraid that it would add a lot of trouble. Anyway, it was just a little effort, so he was not stingy to let them deal with those messy relationships. Zhou Si and the others were not too surprised that Luo Fan wouldn't stay in Nanman for a long time. This master came out from the inner region. Obviously, he was not willing to live a plain life. How could he stay in one place for too long? Not to mention this place was a small city like Nanman. However, what surprised them was that Luo Fan actually gave them time to deal with all kinds of relationships in this city. This was unimaginably generous, and they couldn't help but feel an inexplicable sense of gratitude. From this point of view, they were indeed suitable to be slaves. Seeing the change in their expressions, Luo Fan knew what they were thinking. He just smiled slightly and waved his hand to let them go. Only Ba Yuan was left to serve by his side. He didn't place any restrictions on these immortals, nor did he restrict their power. Instead, he allowed them to do whatever they wanted freely, allowing them to use all of their power. The reason for this? Naturally, it was not that he was naive to think that these people were really convinced and really regarded him as a supreme master who would serve him forever. It was because these people were nothing to him at all. Even if he let them do whatever they wanted, they would never be able to escape from his hands, let alone cause any harm to him. In this case, why would there be any restrictions or restrictions? Moreover, he also believed that Zhou Si and the others absolutely understood how huge the gap between them and him was. If they were smart, they wouldn't have any thoughts of betrayal. It should be known that if they didn't betray him, they would only live as a slave for 3,000 years. But if they betrayed him, they would have to gamble with their lives on a gamble that had an extremely slim chance of winning. It was because of these considerations that this seemingly illogical situation had occurred. After waiting for everyone to leave, Ba Yuan paused for a long time before he finally plucked up his courage and said, May I be so bold as to ask Master for advice? Oh, let's hear it. Luo Fan said indifferently. Ba Yuan raised his right hand and opened his palm. Suddenly, an invisible and colorless flame drilled out of his palm. It was the heart fire. When the flame appeared, Ba Yuan's eyes flashed with doubt, and he asked Luo Fan, What kind of flame is this? Why is it hidden in my body? Luo Fan smiled. He had guessed that Ba Yuan would ask this question. It was indeed as he had expected. However, this was no secret, and there was no need for him to hide it. He immediately smiled and said, This flame is not a flame that exists in a material form. It is the heart fire, or perhaps it could be called the anger fire. It is a flame that is born from the surging emotions in your heart. It is compatible with the great Tao and the soul. Therefore, it possesses the power to contain, abandon, and devour everything. As for why it is hidden in your body, don't tell me you don't know. When Ba Yuan heard Luo Fan describe the heart fire in his hand from an extremely high perspective, he instantly came to a realization. It seemed that his understanding of the heart fire had reached a depth that he had never been able to detect before. Although the heart fire had been drawn out from the depths of his body, he only knew of its existence and did not know why. The only reason he could use it was because the heart fire was unique. It was born from the heart and could naturally change according to his thoughts, allowing him to use it as he pleased. With his abilities, he could not go deep into the heart fire, nor could he see the structure of the heart fire, nor could he touch the origin of the heart fire. Now that he heard Luo Fan's summary, he finally realized that this was the nature of the heart fire. It turned out that his previous understanding of the heart fire was only superficial. In an instant, he gained a lot, and his eyebrows danced with joy. However, very quickly, he thought of Luo Fan's question. He couldn't help but ponder. The heart fire is hidden in my body. It is obviously not acquired, but it was born with me. This means that it must be a gift passed down from my ancestors. When he thought of this, he couldn't help but be shocked. When he was born in the 3 million-foot tall mountain peak. His parents were only normal 8-armed apes. He could not see any difference between them and other normal 8-armed apes. Everything that happened to him since he was born told him that he was a normal 8-armed ape. There was nothing special about him. There was nothing special about him that surpassed normal 8-armed apes. Chapter 768. Seeing Ba Yuan's expression, Luo Fan knew that he had already thought of the answer. He said with a smile, "That's right. Your ancestor was a powerful cultivator who could at least attack the sage level. In other words, he was an immortal who had at least surpassed the 9th stage of immortal realm. The heart fire seed hidden within your body must have been inherited from that time. An immortal that surpassed the 9th rank. I didn't expect such a great existence to be among my ancestors." Ba Yuan murmured, but he was in a daze. Although the immortal realm was divided into 9 ranks, that was only a general method of dividing ranks. The gap between the 9th stage of the immortal realm and the saint stage was almost infinitely large. It was thousands of times greater than the gap between the mortal realm and the 9th stage immortal realm. Therefore, Stage 9 immortals could almost be said to be able to continue increasing their strength without any limit. It would not be a problem for them to increase their strength to billions of times that of when they first entered the Stage 9. But no matter what, as long as he did not become a sage, he would always be an immortal. Even though he was already billions of times stronger than ordinary Stage 9 immortals, it did not change his nature. In front of sages, he was just an ant, an existence that could be crushed with a single finger. These people were countless times more powerful than ordinary Stage 9 immortals, but they were not sages. They were known as immortals who had surpassed the Stage 9 immortal realm, and were publicly acknowledged by the entire great heaven primal world as powerful existences who had the qualifications to break through to the sage realm. Although the golden way of the great firmament was only a realm that Luo Fan had divided according to his own realm of the great Tao and fruit of the way, in this cultivation civilization that had almost developed to its peak, and in the great Tianyuan world that had 800 saints, there was a corresponding realm and corresponding cultivation method that could allow one to reach this realm in a single step, just like the great Tao and fruit of the way. Of course, although they were essentially the same, the world was different. They were both at the peak of the golden way of the great firmament, but in the great Tianyuan world, it was not called the golden way of the great firmament. What was the Daoyuo golden Tao called in the Tianyuan great world? It was time to talk about the finer distinctions between the 9 levels of the great Tianyuan world. In fact, the worldly realm aside, each of the 9 grades of the immortal realm was subdivided into 9 grades. Amongst them, rank 9 was the lowest, and rank 1 was the highest. However, the 9 grades were not the same as the 9 grades. As long as one continued to cultivate, one would be able to advance 1 grade at a time. Instead, it was determined by the cultivation method. Unless there was a great opportunity, the level of one's cultivation method would determine the level of one's cultivation realm. In the future, no matter how he leveled up, he would only be able to level up. He couldn't just rely on this technique to raise his grade. As for the endless cultivation methods that were passed down in the great heaven primal world, they were generally of the lower 3 grades. In other words, even if one cultivated to the end and cultivated to the 9th rank of the immortal realm, they would at most reach the 9th rank, the 8th rank, or the 7th rank. As for the middle 3 grades of cultivation techniques, they were usually controlled by large forces, such as those established by Stage 9 immortals. Apart from these two, the top 3 cultivation methods were usually mastered by sages. Generally speaking, only the disciples of the sages could cultivate. On the other hand, Luo Fan's Dao fruit was at least a top-tier cultivation technique, and it was even highly possible that it was a first-tier cultivation technique. This kind of cultivation method could be used to cultivate the Daoyuo Golden Dao. They should be equivalent to the first stage, 9th stage immortals of the great Tianyuan world. If one cultivated to the peak of the Daoyuo Golden Dao, they would naturally surpass the 9th stage immortals. This knowledge was what Luo Fan heard from the human sovereign. Only the disciples of sages like the human sovereign could truly know the specifics. After all, although the great Tianyuan world's cultivation civilization was unimaginably prosperous, it was impossible for there to be no secrets. The reason why sages were sages was because they were more knowledgeable than ordinary cultivators. They would naturally keep secrets that could allow more sages to appear under their tutelage. Of course, although it was said that they would keep secrets, after such a long period of time and such a large number of cultivators, it was impossible to keep this secret airtight. Some information would definitely leak out and be known by the cultivators of the outside world, and it was not limited to the large forces and the disciples of sages. Therefore, existences like the 8 Yuan immortals. However, they could roughly understand that each rank of immortals was divided into different grades. As for what exactly caused these grades, they were unable to truly understand. They could only make their own guesses based on the various legends. This heart fire is quite powerful. It might even be able to push you to the 3 middle grades. If you have a suitable technique, the 3 upper grades will not be an illusion. Luo Fan looked at 8 Yuan's dazed and shocked expression and smiled. At this moment, 8 Yuan suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He abruptly knelt before Luo Fan and begged bitterly, "Master, please bestow upon 8 Yuan a suitable cultivation technique. In the future, 8 Yuan will definitely repay you with his life." Luo Fan frowned. This 8 Yuan was only his servant. Out of respect for the long time they had known each other, 8 Yuan had already given him some pointers. If he were to pass on a technique to 8 Yuan, it would not be something that could be exchanged for a simple 3,000-year master-servant relationship. This heart flame is too mysterious, and I do not know the corresponding method. You have found the wrong person to look for me. Luo Fan shook his head and said as he thought of this, "Master, please be merciful." 8 Yuan did not listen and continued to plead. However, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and shook his head in disapproval. After a while, 8 Yuan suddenly came to his senses. He hurriedly knelt and said, 8 Yuan is willing to be a slave for 1,000,000 years. I only ask that Master teach me a technique. Originally, becoming a disciple was the most suitable method to seek a technique. However, it was clear that 8 Yuan was not an idiot. He knew his own limits and knew that with his master standards, he would definitely not be interested in becoming a disciple. If he were to say that he was willing to be a disciple, then there would be no hope. Instead, he might as well say that he would be a slave for a longer period of time. As for why it was 1,000,000 years, that was even simpler. Originally, it would not be too much of an exaggeration to say that he would be a slave for eternity. However, it was clear that as a 3rd rank immortal with an infinite lifespan, he would not easily use the adjective eternity. This was the same even when it came to seeking the fundamental technique of cultivation. Thus, he decided on 1,000,000 years as a slave. When Luo Fan heard 8 Yuan's words, he secretly nodded his head. 8 Yuan's conditions were quite suitable. Even though there was no need for him to accept a slave for 1,000,000 years, since 8 Yuan had already made such a huge sacrifice, there was at least a reason for him to teach 8 Yuan. Thus, he smiled faintly and said, "Since you are willing, then let me teach you." "Thank you, master." 8 Yuan was overjoyed. He kowtowed loudly. The entire ground shook violently. "Stand up and talk." Luo Fan waved his hand. 8 Yuan did not dare to argue. He responded and stood up to stand to the side. He looked at Luo Fan with great anticipation. It was obvious that he was extremely curious as to what Luo Fan would say next that would greatly benefit his cultivation. Luo Fan smiled. "I really do not have a technique that is most suitable for the cultivation of the heart, so I cannot give you the complete technique. You don't have to think about it." When 8 Yuan heard this, although he was slightly disappointed, he still knew that Luo Fan had not finished speaking. There would definitely be a solution next. As expected, he then heard Luo Fan continue, "However, I have studied your heart fire a little bit, and I roughly know what its nature is. As for the direction of cultivation, I can still give you some pointers." Then, without waiting for 8 Yuan to speak, he stood up, walked out of the hall, and stood at the entrance. There was a garden at the entrance of the hall. It was not big, but it was not small either. When he looked up, he could see the boundless sky and the boundless sky full of stars. From a certain point of view, the great Tianyuan world and the untainted land had many similarities. At the very least, there was only one sun in this world. Although there were 3 moons in the boundless state of chaos, this similarity was already extremely rare. At this moment, it was already nighttime. 3 bright moons hung high in the sky. Each of the moons was the size of a disk, and it looked as if they were extremely close to the ground. Each of the 3 moons was spreading the essence of the moon to the entire world. The essence of the moon was different from that of the untainted land, but it was similar in nature. Moreover, the essence of the moon was different from that of the untainted land. Each of them had their own characteristics and characteristics. When the 3 kinds of essence of the moon intertwined, they formed an extremely wonderful complementing each other, turning into an even more incredible power that spread between the heavens and the earth. Looking at the moons in the sky, Luo Fan said to 8 Yuan, who had also walked out behind him, "You have lived in this world for tens of millions of years. Have you ever really seen this beautiful night sky?" When 8 Yuan heard Luo Fan suddenly say this, he could not help but be stunned. He raised his head to look at the night sky above his head, and suddenly felt an indescribable calmness in his heart. The slight anger that he could maintain in order to maintain the vigor of the heart fire had unknowingly subsided under the cleansing of the night sky. His mood gradually calmed down, and his heart fire also began to gradually quiet down along with the change in his emotions. It began to gradually calm down and gradually accumulated in his heart, as if it was about to be extinguished. However, although it looked like it was about to be extinguished, the heart fire showed a sense of immortality, as if this ball of heart fire had truly stabilized. From then on, even if it was shaken by the wind and rain, even if it encountered countless attacks, it would never die. The heart fire was the fire of emotions. As long as it still had emotions, anger, and spirit, it would not die. The tenacity of life, the tenacity of the heart fire. Under such circumstances, the heart fire naturally did not need to maintain the strength of the heart fire by maintaining anger. In a trance, 8 Yuan seemed to understand why Luo Fan said these words that seemed to have nothing to do with cultivation. However, at this moment, it was difficult for him to be moved. He felt that indescribable calmness, looked at the 3 moons hanging high in the night sky, and looked at the countless stars in the distance. He only felt that his spirit seemed to be continuously rising. Although he did not enter the mysterious state that he entered when he broke through from the 2nd stage to the 3rd stage and saw the boundless laws, he was already close to that state. In this state, he felt the vastness of the world like never before, and he truly saw how insignificant he was. When living beings felt how insignificant they were, It was when they could truly recognize themselves. It was also when they could truly understand the world. At this moment, 8 Yuan suddenly felt his own existence like never before. He felt the power in his body, and he felt the heart fire. In a trance, the heart fire in his heart seemed to stabilize a lot, and the feeling of immortality became even more intense. The feeling that was about to be extinguished also faded a lot. After an unknown period of time, 8 Yuan came back to his senses and realized that it was already late at night. The 3 moons had gradually overlapped. They had fallen to the ground. His master had already moved a recliner over and was lying comfortably not far away from him. In his hand was a cup of tea that had been sent over by someone, and he was savoring it. "How do you feel?" Seeing that 8 Yuan had woken up, Luo Fan smiled. 8 Yuan said. To him, midnight was not much different from the blink of an eye. To him, waiting for 8 Yuan by the side was not a big deal. Moreover, although he was waiting, he was also enjoying the quiet night sky, feeling that the night sky was completely different from the untainted world. "Thank you for your guidance, Master." 8 Yuan now feels unprecedentedly clear-headed, and his spirit can be considered to have calmed down. 8 Yuan said hurriedly. At this moment, Yuan's body seemed to be empty, but it also seemed to be very full. The heart fire seemed to be holed up in his heart, but it also seemed to be able to explode with its strongest power at any time and directly kill all opponents. This feeling was completely different from the feeling of the heart fire circulating endlessly in his body, but it was more wonderful and comfortable. It also felt more powerful. Moreover, most importantly, he no longer had to force himself to maintain a state of anger. Instead, he could feel and see everything in the outside world with a normal state of mind. The heart fire looks like a flame, but in fact, its essence is the power of the mind. If you cultivate it like a flame, no matter how hard you work, you can at most step into the 3 middle grades. If you want to rely on the heart fire to step into the 3 upper grades, you need to recognize the origin. The key is to cultivate your mind, improve your state of mind, and improve your Taoist heart, Luo Fan said. You have lived for such a long time. I believe there are many ways to cultivate the state of mind. I have here a way to cultivate the state of mind. If you think it is useful, you can cultivate it. If you think it is useless, you can also choose your own way to cultivate the state of mind. As he spoke, Luo Fan pointed casually. The primordial qi in the void naturally condensed into a piece of text. It emitted a faint fluorescent light. After the text was formed, Luo Fan's body swayed and disappeared in front of 8 Yuan. 8 Yuan had long been convinced by Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan had said so, how could he really treat this way of cultivating the state of mind as ordinary? However, he was unable to divert his attention to check where Luo Fan had gone. He was only concentrating on memorizing every single word in his heart. In the untainted world, a 3rd stage immortal was equivalent to a golden immortal. Its power was naturally not ordinary. Having a photographic memory was just a small ability. Therefore, after reading it once, he had already completely engraved the entire cultivation method in the depths of his memory. The moment he memorized the text, his primordial qi shook and the entire text instantly dispersed. It merged into the void again and merged with the endless primordial qi in the surroundings. It was difficult to see any trace of its existence. Only then did 8 Yuan heave a sigh of relief. He finally had the time to carefully comprehend the text. This text recorded a miraculous cultivation method. This cultivation method was completely different from any cultivation method 8 Yuan had seen before. However, with one look, he felt that this cultivation method was more authentic than any of the cultivation methods he had seen before. It was more in line with the laws of the great Tianyuan world, and even the great Tao. This method was a dream cultivation method. After cultivating, a cultivator would naturally enter a dream and directly create a world in the dream according to all of his memories. This world was very crude at first, but as one's cultivation deepened, it would become more and more perfect and vast. In the end, it might even be as boundless as the outside world, and as real as the outside world. As expected, this cultivation method only cultivated the mind. As for power, he had not touched it at all. Even if he cultivated this cultivation method to its peak, without the support of external power, he would only be a weak mortal without the strength to truss a chicken. 8 Yuan was a little doubtful about whether this cultivation method could really improve his flame of heart, and whether it could really improve his cultivation realm. However, Luo Fan's strength was right in front of him, and he had already mentioned it before, so he suppressed his doubts and directly sat down cross-legged on the ground and began to cultivate this cultivation method. As a third-stage immortal, 8 Yuan's mind was already extremely strong. Now that he had the corresponding cultivation method, he quickly cultivated this cultivation method. This cultivation method was also divided by Luo Fan into two major realms, the mortal realm and the immortal realm. At the same time, each major realm was also divided into 9 stages. Of course, the cultivation method for the immortal realm was only up to the 5th stage. With Luo Fan's ability, he could actually create a 6th and 7th stage cultivation method. However, there was no need for that. 8 Yuan did not have the qualifications to make him give everything he had. According to his understanding of 8 Yuan, when 8 Yuan really cultivated this cultivation method to the 5th stage of the immortal realm, it would probably take him at least tens of millions of years, and he might never reach the 5th stage of the immortal realm. Luo Fan was already very generous to teach him a cultivation method up to the 5th stage of the immortal realm. The cultivation method did not involve power, but purely cultivation of the mind. After cultivating it, 8 Yuan felt as if he had come to a wonderful world in a trance. Chapter 769. A mountain gradually formed out of nothingness. The mountain was more than 3 million feet tall. There were countless plants on it, as well as a great number of unusual creatures. There was also a powerful aura entrenched on the mountain. In a trance, Ba Yuan completely lost all of his memories after he met Luo Fan. It was as if he had returned to the past, to the state of cultivation and survival in the place where he was born and raised. When this feeling appeared, Ba Yuan really did return to that state. He opened his eyes and looked around blankly. He was surrounded by scenes that he had seen for who knows how many millions of years. The auras around him were also auras that he had sensed for who knows how many years. He took a deep breath. An incomparably rich, acquired yuan qi of the universe poured into his body, making him feel like his entire body had never been filled before. An indescribable sense of peace made him sigh in contentment. However, after this sigh, he was once again surprised. I've lived like this for tens of millions of years. I've also seen this world for tens of millions of years. Why do I suddenly feel that these days are peaceful and comfortable? Why do I suddenly feel an indescribable sense of joy? When this thought appeared, he realized how awkward his body was. It was as if he vaguely understood what direction he should go in and how he should cultivate to a higher level, a form that was more in line with the great Tao. Suddenly, he realized that the power in his body was somewhat awkward. It was as if his power shouldn't be limited to this level, and his strength shouldn't be limited to this realm. All of these feelings intertwined together, causing a strange feeling to well up in Ba Yuan's heart. It was as if some incomparably important change had happened before, but he had forgotten about it. This feeling was so strange that Ba Yuan's rationality didn't quite believe it. He thought that it was just an illusion. However, the various strange feelings told him that it was very likely that this feeling was real. Such a contradictory feeling made Ba Yuan start to carefully study his own body, trying to follow his own feelings. He began to change his body bit by bit, changing his power. This mountain that was more than 3 million feet tall clearly couldn't be anywhere else. It could only be the mountain that Ba Yuan had stayed in for tens of millions of years. It was the spiritual cultivation technique that Luo Fan had imparted to Ba Yuan, and had been recreated based on Ba Yuan's memories. It was the combination of all of Ba Yuan's memories of that mountain. Of course, based on the tens of millions of years that Ba Yuan had spent on that mountain, the mountain that he had recreated using his memories would not be much different from the real situation. Ba Yuan lost a lot of his memories and threw himself into the mountain to continue his previous life. This was the effect of the cultivation method created by Luo Fan. Tempering one's spirit didn't require power, but to allow one's spirit to experience and feel. In order to achieve these goals, apart from allowing people to experience the various states of life and travel the world to shock their own souls, the only other way was to create miracles, create the various states of life, and create the world to shock their own souls. In the eyes of mortals, it was almost impossible to use a miracle created by oneself to shake one's heart. Because you created it yourself, you naturally have absolute control over it. Naturally, it wouldn't cause too much of shock to his mind. But for cultivators at the level of Luo Fan, although it was troublesome, it wasn't impossible. For example, the technique that Luo Fan had imparted to Ba Yuan. It had such a mysterious effect. This technique was extremely mysterious. Once it was activated, it would naturally extract the cultivator's memories and use a perspective that was countless times superior to the cultivator's own to rearrange these memories. It would even seal the cultivator's own memories, making it seem as if the cultivator had never experienced these memories before. The cultivator would experience these memories from a different perspective and experience them again as if they were experiencing these memories for the first time, producing the same shock and effect. It even surpassed the effect of truly experiencing the various states of life and traveling the world. For the next few days, Ba Yuan had been standing at the entrance of the Great Hall. His eyes were blank and lifeless, and the aura within his body was completely restrained. At first glance, he looked like a clay statue. Zhou Si and the others received Luo Fan's instructions. They knew that Ba Yuan was in the middle of cultivation. Although they didn't know why cultivation needed to be like this, they could only look at him with envious eyes. None of them went to disturb him, so that Ba Yuan could have a quiet cultivation environment to cultivate. As for Luo Fan himself, he wandered around the southern barbarian city alone while studying the map of the wild continent. The wild continent was vast and boundless. The map clearly recorded everything about the entire wild continent. The amount of information contained in it could naturally be imagined. If one were to wander around the wild continent at random, it might take tens of thousands of years or even hundreds of thousands of years to be able to explore the entire wild continent. And if he encountered something that was helpful to him, then this period of time might even increase by several times. This kind of inefficient method was obviously not what Luo Fan was willing to choose. If there was no map to guide him, then it would be fine. But if there was a map to guide him and he still used this method, then he would be stupid. After continuous research, Luo Fan finally determined a route to travel. This route started in the southern barbarian city, bypassed nearly 100 natural danger zones that were not specifically shown on the map, and finally arrived at the northernmost city that was not shown on the map. When he determined this route to travel through the wild continent, Luo Fan was almost done in the southern barbarian city. He felt that he wouldn't gain much if he continued to wander, so he decided to leave the southern barbarian city and start on the route that he had previously determined. And at this time, it was already 10 days after Ba Yuan started cultivating. 10 days is 10 million years. After such a long time, it should be time for me to comprehend the illusory reality and wake up. As he made his decision, Luo Fan suddenly thought of Ba Yuan, and such a thought appeared in his mind. That cultivation method was created by Luo Fan. He clearly understood all the principles and mysteries within it. Therefore, he naturally understood that if this cultivation method was activated by Ba Yuan, to what extent would the flow of time reach? According to his calculations, with Ba Yuan's cultivation realm and heart fire, in the world created by the cultivation method, one day in the outside world was equivalent to 1 million years. Calculating it, 10 days was naturally 10 million years. His thoughts moved slightly. Luo Fan had already arrived at the Zhong hairpin troops encampment. As soon as he arrived, he found that the heart fire within Ba Yuan's body, which was on the verge of collapse, suddenly shook and then suddenly soared. In an instant, it expanded countless times. It directly enveloped his entire body, making him seem to have turned into a man of fire in an instant. This heart fire was formless and colorless, but its temperature was extremely astonishing. Once it was enveloped, it would naturally change the surrounding void, change the surrounding yuan qi, and cause a huge distortion in the surroundings. Thus, a huge outline was outlined, outlining Bai Yuan and the flames around his body. This change naturally alarmed the original owner of the manor, Zhou Si and the others. For a moment, they put down the various problems that they were dealing with and flew from all over the manor. In a short while, they landed at a position dozens of feet away from Bai Yuan. The power of the heart fire on Bai Yuan's body was extremely strong, and the temperature was extremely high. Although they could withstand it, withstanding the high temperature was after all not something to be pleased about. But they would not bring trouble upon themselves. Thus, they stayed at a position where they could see clearly, but was not too burned by the heart fire. At this time, when they saw Luo Fan, they hurriedly came up to greet him. Then, they stood to one side, not daring to pass Luo Fan. Luo Fan did not care about them. He only looked at Bai Yuan. This was not because he cared about Bai Yuan, but because he wanted to see how Bai Yuan would perform after practicing the cultivation method that he had created. He wanted to see if there was anything that could be improved upon. Bai Yuan's body changed extremely quickly. As the heart fire burned fiercely, a faint shadow of light rushed out from the top of his head. It was held up by the endless heart fire and floated in midair. This shadow of light was a mountain that was more than 3 million feet high. This mountain peak, it was the mountain peak that Bai Yuan had stayed on for tens of millions of years. It was also the mountain peak that Bai Yuan had stayed on for 10 million years in the past 10 days. However, compared to when it had just been formed and when Bai Yuan had just entered it, this mountain had undergone an earth-shattering change. At this moment, the entire mountain peak had turned into a volcano. All the living creatures on the mountain had been infected by the flames. Among them, the originally powerful auras were frantically struggling in the flames, trying their best to break free. Angry roars and cries of fear continuously rang out from the mountain peak. Ip King, we were born on the same mountain. Although we occasionally fought, we were friends for tens of millions of years. Why did you have to kill us today? Roars of disbelief continuously rang out from the mountain peak. If all of you were real, I would naturally not kill you. However, all of you are merely distracting thoughts of mine. If I do not refine all of you, my soul will not be pure, and I will never be able to transcend. At this moment, a leisurely sigh reverberated through the mountain. It was Bai Yuan's voice. The origin of this voice could not be found on the mountain. Instead, it came from outside the mountain, from a level higher than the mountain. It came from a mysterious place that overlooked the entire mountain. Following these words, the various voices on the mountain paused. Then, even louder curses rang out. You lunatic, we are real living creatures. How can we be your distracting thoughts? Let us out. Bai Yuan was unmoved by all of this. The flames continued to burn the entire mountain peak. As the flames burned, the living creatures on the mountain peak continued to die and turn into nothingness. The miserable cries and curses also gradually weakened and eventually disappeared. As all the living beings disappeared, the main body of the mountain gradually melted under the heat and shrank. In the end, when all the changes had calmed down, the mountain had already transformed into a crystalline and translucent sphere that was the size of a thumb, and it flickered with strands of the brilliance of wisdom. The substance floated in the flames. No matter how the flames burned, it only became more crystalline and transparent. The wisps of intelligent light on it even became denser and more dazzling because of the burning. At this moment, the heart fire around Bai Yuan's body shook. It shrank slightly and instantly shrunk back into his body, once again occupying his heart. However, this time, the heart fire was no longer a small dot on his heart. Instead, it enveloped the entire heart. He continuously licked the heart, causing strands of impurities in the originally dense and pure heart to occasionally turn into mist and float out, leaving his body through the apertures. Under these circumstances, His heart grew stronger and stronger as time passed. The strengthening of his heart also caused his blood to change. The change in his blood caused his entire body to become stronger and stronger. This process continued without end, as if it would never end. After a long while, the glittering and translucent orb that flickered with the brilliance of intelligence sank into Ba Yuan's body through the aperture on the top of his head. As the sphere returned, Ba Yuan slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were filled with endless vicissitudes of life. They also contained a determination to see through everything and an incomparably firm belief. He looked around. The vicissitudes of life, determination, and belief in his eyes gradually faded and returned to normal. However, compared to before, there was more awareness and confidence in his eyes. From this, it could be seen that he was completely different from before. After Ba Yuan came back to his senses, he bowed to Luo Fan. Ba Yuan, thank you for your help, Master. Looks like you've already reached the 3rd stage of the 6th stage. You've barely entered the middle 3 stages. You've made such progress in just 10 days. Looks like you've been diligently cultivating. Luo Fan smiled. It's all thanks to Master's exquisite technique. Otherwise, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to comprehend the aperture and enter the middle 3 stages even after 10 million years. Ba Yuan was even more grateful and bowed again. Hearing the conversation between Luo Fan and Ba Yuan, Zhou Si and the others couldn't help but feel envious. The outer realm was completely different from the inner realm. For the living beings of the inner realm, knowing that each stage was divided into different grades only made them feel that cultivation was boundless and that they were insignificant. It wouldn't affect them too much. But for the outer realm, it wasn't the same. The outer realm was a world where the strong preyed on the weak. In this world, any difference in strength could be said to be the difference between life and death. Therefore, after knowing that each stage was divided into 9 stages, almost all the cultivators of the outer realm had an incomparably urgent desire to improve their own stages. However, it was clear that the living beings of the outer realm were much stronger than the living beings of the inner realm due to their living conditions, but there wasn't much of a difference in essence. They could find countless cultivation techniques, but most of them were only of the lower 3 stages. Apart from a very small number of large forces who possessed a few cultivation techniques of the middle 3 stages and could cultivate to the middle 3 stages, most of the other cultivators only knew of the existence of the middle 3 stages. Not many cultivators knew exactly what the middle 3 stages were. This wasn't strange at all. Compared to the billions of living beings in the great heaven primordial world, these existences under the saints were like a drop of water in the ocean. If this drop of water wasn't willing to reveal information, then the only thing that could find out about this drop of water was a very, very small part of the seawater next to this drop of water. Apart from this very, very small part, the entire ocean definitely knew nothing about this drop of water. Zhou Si and the others were also living beings of the outer realm, so they naturally had the same desire. It was just that they had never been able to find an opportunity to enter the door. At this moment, they suddenly saw a person suddenly rise from the lower 3 grades to the middle 3 grades. To them, this was like a mortal looking at an ordinary person suddenly ascending to become an immortal. The envy and jealousy in their eyes could be imagined to an unimaginable degree. For a moment, the few of them looked at each other. Xi and AI and the others looked at Zhou Si with questioning eyes. It was obvious that they were asking if they should also beg Luo Fan like Ba Yuan, so that Luo Fan would give them some opportunities as well. Zhou Si's eyes were filled with excitement and struggle. However, after a long time, his rationality prevailed, and he slowly shook his head at the few of them. Seeing Zhou Si shake his head, the few of them gradually came to their senses. A look of realization appeared on their faces, and their rationality returned. They understood why this wasn't the right time. The few of them had only been slaves to Luo Fan for about 10 days. The first time they met, they had wanted to rob Luo Fan, but they had kicked an iron plate. Instead of robbing him, they became his slaves. Under these circumstances, they would be the first to not believe that they had any friendship with Luo Fan. The benefits of raising their own ranks were so great that it could almost completely change their destinies. It would allow them to leave their previous ranks and step into a higher one. With this kind of friendship, it was almost impossible for them to ask for such benefits. Under these circumstances, if they tried to ask for it, the result would definitely be that Luo Fan felt that they had no sense of propriety or even that they were stupid. Instead, it would make it impossible for them to ask for it in the future. Understanding this, the few of them regained their clarity. However, their gazes towards Luo Fan became even more fervent. For a moment, their attitudes became even more respectful and obedient. Chapter 770. At this moment, Bai Yuan's heart was filled with an indescribable emotion. Although he seemed to have stood at the entrance of the hall for 10 days, in reality, his soul and consciousness had already sunk into the world deep within him for tens of millions of years. Tens of millions of years. Even though Bai Yuan had already experienced tens of millions of years, he definitely could not treat this period of time as a short period of time. During this long period of time, if not for the tiny imprint left behind in his heart from the cultivation method reminding him, he might have already sunk into the incomparably real world. He might have treated that world as a completely real world, and all the living beings he encountered there as completely real. If he had truly sunk into it completely, the final outcome might not have been the same as other living beings who were unable to extricate themselves from the illusions of the outside world. In the end, his consciousness would have collapsed, and his soul would have disintegrated. However, it would have also completely crippled the cultivation method he had already grasped. He might not even be able to cultivate that cultivation method in the future. In the end, he would have completely wasted the rare opportunity that he had exchanged 1,000,000 years of freedom for. Fortunately, when he had just thrown himself into the mountain that was over 3,000,000 feet tall, he followed the strange feeling in his heart and cultivated. He actually managed to easily cultivate the born Taoism aptitude of this world and even directly raise the flames in his body by several levels. As a result, he gained a certain idealistic characteristic that was the characteristic of the heart fire. It was precisely because of this gain that he believed in the feeling that the cultivation method left behind in the depths of his heart. It allowed him to know that everything before him was very wrong, and it allowed him to know that he was definitely missing some extremely important memories that could even change his fate. Under these circumstances, even though he felt that living on the mountain was so stable, so comfortable, and so peaceful, he could not completely immerse himself in it. He still tried his best to search for those exact memories. As such, after he cultivated the born Taoism aptitude and raised the level of the power in his body, he began to search around the mountain and interact with all the living beings on the mountain. He hoped that he could be inspired through this search and contact, and thus obtain the answers he wanted. However, it was clear that this mountain and all of the living beings on it had been created by the natural circulation of that cultivation method, according to all of the relevant memories in his mind. Everything that he could think of, everything that he could deduce, had already been constructed perfectly. No matter how he searched or how he touched it, it was just like everything in the real world. It was so perfect that he couldn't find a single flaw, and it didn't have any effect on him that would allow him to find the answer. It was as if he was in the real world, and everything he came into contact with were real creatures and real matter. If it was an illusion constructed by the outside world, with Bai Yuan's intelligence, he might have dispelled those feelings in his heart. However, this was not an illusion constructed by the outside world. Instead, it was an illusion constructed by a cultivation technique that he cultivated. The purpose of this illusion was not to make him fall. It existed for him to break. Therefore, even if everything he found and came into contact with denied the feeling in his heart, that feeling was still like a tarsal bone. It was impossible to get rid of, constantly reminding him that something was wrong, reminding him that he should work hard to find some answers. This kind of encounter with the contradiction in the depths of his heart was simply a kind of torment for Bai Yuan. Even though he had originally felt incomparably peaceful in this place, he was now in a state of torment. The mountain that was incomparably comfortable became incomparably painful. This pain haunted him for a very long time. At first, it only made him feel uncomfortable. After hundreds of thousands of years, it even made him feel extremely irritated, and he vented his anger everywhere. The situation on this mountain was the same as the situation on the mountain in his memories. The strongest living beings on the mountain were about the same level as he was before his ascension. Therefore, when he cultivated the born Taoism aptitude and the power in his body underwent a transformation, he became the most powerful being on the mountain. Therefore, he very quickly beat up all the powerful living beings on the mountain. In reality, he became the most powerful being on the mountain. Although he didn't directly become the supreme ruler of the mountain, he still gained the respect and fear of all living beings. This process of venting continued for hundreds of thousands of years. After hundreds of thousands of years, he finally grew tired of venting like this. Or rather, venting like this could no longer alleviate the irritation in his heart. It could no longer relieve the pressure on his heart. Therefore, after that, as if he was dead, he laid down in his nest and began to introspect himself. He began to understand all the details of his body. Since he couldn't seek external help, he began to look inward, hoping to find the answers he needed through studying his own body. This process lasted for nearly 9 million years. In other words, from when he first felt that pouring out his frustrations on the entire mountain was pointless and could no longer reduce his irritation, until he finally broke through the barrier and returned to the real world, he had been lying in his nest and introspecting himself. Or rather, he was cultivating in peace. As mentioned before, the flame of the heart is a type of emotional fire. It is a strange fire born from the soul, and one could even say that it is not a fire at all. Therefore, cultivating the soul is the correct way to cultivate the flame of the heart. Although Ba Yuan's memories of his contact with Luo Fan were sealed by the technique, the flame of the heart was still activated by him. Even though it was sealed, it still left some traces in his soul. These traces directly penetrated deep into the source of his life. If Luo Fan were to make a move, he would naturally be able to completely seal it. However, if Ba Yuan used his own cultivation technique, no matter how profound it was, it would not be able to completely seal these traces. Naturally, there would be some traces left behind that could not be erased. Because of this, when Ba Yuan's introspection reached a certain level, he was able to grasp these traces. And when he grasped these traces, the irritation in his heart completely disappeared. A kind of epiphany appeared in his mind. Because with these traces, he understood. His feelings were not fake. He really did lose some important memories. He really did have some unimaginable experiences in the past. He really did possess an unparalleled power that far surpassed what he currently possessed. Furthermore, he could even faintly feel that the world he resided in was a little strange and awkward, or in other words, fake. After understanding all of this, the irritation in his heart naturally disappeared. The reason for this was because although the situation he was in did not change because he understood all of these things, he had completely understood the situation he was in. He understood the direction of his efforts and no longer had any doubts about whether his efforts were futile. Without such doubts, he naturally no longer felt irritable. After grasping these traces, Ba Yuan began to follow these traces and began to cultivate again. Step by step, he started from zero and continuously raised his realm and his strength. He worked hard to stimulate his own potential and worked hard to get closer to those traces in order to regain the power that he had once obtained but did not know why it had disappeared. This kind of process, it was a process that took time. It was also a process that required endless patience and perseverance to complete. Although Luo Fan looked down on Ba Yuan's wisdom and felt that he would not have a good future in the future, he was, after all, a creature that had cultivated for tens of millions of years. His wisdom would not be that bad. In this kind of situation where there was only one path he could take, he still had patience and perseverance. As such, after spending millions of years, he finally comprehended the key point before his 10 days in the outside world were about to end, which was also the 10 million years he had spent in the spiritual world. He reignited the heart fire in his body. The heart fire. It possessed unimaginable might and indescribable effects on the mind. When the heart fire appeared, it instantly ignited his entire body. It then spread out, burning his lair and the 3 million zhang tall mountain he was on. It completely ignited the sky, the surrounding land, and all the creatures on it. At that moment, Bai Yuan finally understood the truth of this world. He understood that he was in the depths of his own mind, that this world was formed from his mind, and that it was born from his memories. When he understood all of this, he felt an indescribable joy in his heart. In that instant, he felt a sense of transcendence. His entire body dispersed and turned into an incomparably transcendent existence that enveloped the entire world. In his eyes, the image of the countless creatures within it also underwent an earth-shattering change. The true appearance of those creatures was no longer concealed in front of him. As it turns out, they are all projections of the distracting thoughts in my mind. Every single creature is a bit of my distracting thoughts. If I want to truly transcend, I need to completely refine these distracting thoughts. After understanding this, he did not hesitate at all. He naturally activated the heart fire and directly destroyed all the creatures on the mountain. As a result, the scene that Luo Fan and the others saw happened. In reality, Bai Yuan's idea was not wrong. The creatures on the mountain were constructed by the cultivation method based on the memories of the creatures on the mountain. They were no different from the real creatures he knew. However, any creature's perception of the outside world and its memories of the outside world were somewhat subjective. In other words, no matter what kind of creature it was, its perception of other creatures was distorted by its own will. It could almost be said to be an illusion. It was just that the severity of this illusion differed for different creatures. For example, some creatures living in their own world felt that everyone they saw had to return the favor to them. Whatever others did, they felt that it was a conspiracy against them. On the other hand, some creatures that were more rational could recognize other creatures closer to the truth and would not misunderstand just because of small action. Therefore, this kind of illusion would not affect the existence of living beings and their understanding of the world. Instead, because of this illusion, it created thousands of different mentalities, different thoughts, and different spirits. In the spiritual world that Bai Yuan constructed through the cultivation method, the countless living beings were created based on his memories, so it was only natural that this illusion was displayed to its greatest extent. At this realm, some of his thoughts would naturally fuse with these creatures. For example, distracting thoughts that were disdainful of certain things would fuse with creatures that were extremely disdainful of that thing. There were so many such things. Any living being would inevitably have countless distracting thoughts at every moment. As for these distracting thoughts, for ordinary creatures, they would only make them less rational. They would not be able to concentrate on thinking and doing things. There would not be any other serious consequences. But for cultivators, the consequences would not be so simple. For cultivators, only pure thoughts could allow them to better comprehend the laws of the world and understand the mysteries of the Grand Tao. The existence of these distracting thoughts would definitely affect the efficiency of this kind of comprehension, which would affect the cultivator's cultivation. For cultivators, the consequences were naturally quite serious. Even distracting thoughts could be said to be a type of aptitude. If there were too many distracting thoughts, then a creature would not be able to become a cultivator. If there were too few distracting thoughts, then a creature's cultivation speed would be several times, tens of times, or even hundreds of times faster than other cultivators with the same conditions. Distracting thoughts were extremely harmful to cultivators. Originally, any cultivator would try their best to get rid of them. However, it was a pity that distracting thoughts were born at every moment. Unless one could constantly be aware of their existence and get rid of them. Otherwise, no matter how many distracting thoughts he got rid of, new distracting thoughts would definitely appear in the next moment. It would not help at all. Bai Yuan's heart flame was a wondrous flame that was born from the spirit. It had a wondrous connection with his spirit at all times. Thus, he had the conditions to get rid of distracting thoughts at all times. As long as he refined these distracting thoughts, then no matter when these distracting thoughts appeared in the future, as long as he willed it, it would cause the heart flame to burn and eliminate these distracting thoughts. This would maintain the purity of his spirit and allow him to enter a better state of cultivation. Of course, this wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. After all, distracting thoughts were relative. Not every thought was a distracting thought at all times, and not every thought other than cultivation was a distracting thought. This heart flame was an extremely idealistic flame, and its control was completely based on Bai Yuan's will. When to get rid of distracting thoughts, and when to keep them, this was completely up to him. However, it wasn't to turn him into a robot that only knew how to cultivate when that mountain peak was refined. What remained after the countless living beings and the world of the spirit was refined was none other than the core of that cultivation technique. This core was extremely mysterious. It was like a thought, but it wasn't. It was a mysterious existence that existed between reality and illusion. It could exist in one's mind like a thought, but it could also continuously improve according to his cultivation of that cultivation technique. The formation of this core also meant that Bai Yuan's cultivation of that cultivation technique was on the right track. In the future, he wouldn't need to uncontrollably throw himself into the world of creation like this time. Instead, he would be able to continuously pour all the information he saw and heard into it, continuously accumulate, continuously transform, and finally, through his own will, create a more and more perfect world of illusion. He would then send his thoughts into it and allow the world to refine him. At the same time, because of the mysterious nature of that cultivation technique, this process would naturally attract all sorts of distracting thoughts into it. And in the end, it would be refined by his heart flame. This would allow his heart flame to burn and eliminate more and more distracting thoughts. In the end, it would be able to completely eliminate all distracting thoughts. From then on, his spirit would be pure and his thoughts would be clear. There would be no more concealment, and he would be able to clearly reflect the world and the Tao. With this, he would no longer have any bottlenecks or obstacles. His cultivation realm would be limitless, and he would finally reach the peak of the immortal realm. This would also depend on his own cultivation realm. If the cultivation technique's realm was insufficient, when his cultivation realm rose to a certain level, his distracting thoughts would also become so strong that they would not be drawn into the core. At that time, his new distracting thoughts would naturally not be eliminated. Instead, they would accumulate more and more, and in the end, he would completely return his state before he obtained the cultivation technique. This was also the reason why such a mystical cultivation technique could be divided into different levels. At this moment, the cultivation technique that Bai Yuan obtained was to reach the 5th rank of the immortal realm. In other words, as long as Bai Yuan broke through the 5th rank of the immortal realm, he would have to obtain the cultivation technique of the next rank. Otherwise, the cultivation technique's effects would become increasingly weaker, and in the end, it would become completely useless. Naturally, Bai Yuan would not think that far ahead, or perhaps even if he thought about it, he would not take it to heart. With his current cultivation realm as a 3rd rank immortal, if he wanted to reach the 5th rank of the immortal realm, it would take him at least tens of millions of years. He might even never reach it. If he thought about that problem now, it would truly be a groundless worry. Thus, when he occasionally had this thought, it was directly treated as distracting thoughts and burned away by the fire of his heart. At this moment, Bai Yuan was kneeling in front of Luo Fan. In his heart, there was only gratitude towards Luo Fan. At this moment, he felt that the cultivation technique that he exchanged for 1,000,000 years of freedom could be said to be the best choice he had made in his entire life. Luo Fan looked at Bai Yuan and smiled. Just do your job well in the future. Get up. Bai Yuan was so grateful towards Luo Fan that he naturally would not go against his wishes. He bowed again and said, Bai Yuan will definitely do his utmost until the day I die. Then he stood up, concealed his aura, and stood solemnly beside Luo Fan. Chapter 771. For Luo Fan, the residence was just a place to stay. In fact, it didn't have much significance. He didn't need to rest and recuperate here. Asterisk, therefore, after deciding on the destination, determining the route, and there were no more obstacles, he was too lazy to wait in this manner. He didn't need to be entangled like a layman. So he asked directly and prepared to take them to leave Nanman. When Josie and the others heard it, they knew Luo Fan's plan. They immediately said with a serious face, "Everything in Nanman has been handled properly. If Master is willing, you can leave at any time." Luo Fan smiled and said, "That's good. Then let's go now." Josie and the others didn't dare to ask where the destination was, and they immediately agreed in unison. As for asking Luo Fan to give them a chance and let them upgrade, they had already discussed it before and decided to take their time to think about it. Naturally, they wouldn't mention it at this time. After speaking, Luo Fan didn't fly up, and he didn't let Josie and the others take out their flying escape magic tools, although he knew that Josie and the others must have excellent flying escape magic tools. Instead, he directly took out a cloud-like flying escape magic tool that he bought in the Myriad Tool Pavilion when he entered Nanman. This magic tool used an extremely unorthodox sacrificial refining method that Luo Fan had never seen before. It was a kind of cloud-like creature between heaven and earth that was directly sacrificial refined, and a judgment magic tool was used to replace the will of the creature. The beauty of this magic tool was that it had considerable autonomy. Although its spirituality was not comparable to magic tools, it was much stronger than ordinary magic tools. But its weakness was also quite obvious. Once it was sacrificial refined, it couldn't be upgraded. The level of the magic tool that was sacrificial refined would always be the same level. It was impossible to upgrade it to the magic tool level. Therefore, it was regarded as an unorthodox sacrificial refining method and not the mainstream sacrificial refining method in Tianyuan world. After all, it had no potential to upgrade. A magic tool that couldn't become a magic tool, no matter how strong and exquisite it was only a one-time method. There was no continuity at all. Naturally, it cannot become mainstream. The reason why Luo Fan took a fancy to this magical tool was not because it was fast, but because he had a better way to refine this magical tool. Although it was impossible to change the nature of this magical tool and make it have the potential to become a magical tool, it could still greatly increase its power. At least, the flying speed was greatly increased. After all, this magic tool's original form was a cloud-shaped creature. With Luo Fan's abilities, it was a simple matter for him to increase the creature's ability to fly. After the cloud left Sleeve Universe, Luo Fan casually patted the cloud, and the afterworld natural energy condensed into strange lines, forming a mysterious and unimaginably complicated symbol. One by one, they sank into the clouds, deep into the core of the clouds, and gathered together. It immediately shook, producing boundless radiance, drawing upon the laws of the underworld, immediately penetrating this cloud. As this happened, the cloud flickered and expanded. In the blink of an eye, it was more than 100 times bigger than before. As it rippled, it even emitted a mysterious aura that could disappear at any time. It also seemed to merge with the void and distort distance. In an instant, it contained the meaning of billions of miles. It was obvious that this magic tool's power was many times stronger than before. It's a pity that the nature is there. No matter how strong it is, it's just a magic tool, Luo Fan thought. Luo Fan was so dissatisfied, but Josie and the others were already dumbfounded. It was almost unbelievable. Although they were already aware of Luo Fan's strength and knew that the might of his divine ability had reached an unimaginable level, they never thought that it would be so powerful. They never thought that the might of his divine ability would reach such an unimaginable level. Although the refinement method of the cloud-shaped artifact was unorthodox, and unmainstream, it was still a refinement method chosen by many living beings. Thus, even Bai Yuan had a considerable understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of this refinement method. Thus, they understood that the power of the magic tools refined using this method was mysterious. It could be used to refine countless types of magic tools, but to increase the power of an already mature magic tool was as difficult as ascending to the heavens. It was even thousands of times more difficult than refining a living creature into a magic tool, let alone increasing the power of the magic tool by 100 times in one go. In fact, they had never heard of any existence that had ever done this before. However, at this very moment, their master, the Buddha's hand, had merely clapped his hands casually. He did not even need to gather energy or spend any time to directly transform this ritual implement, causing its power to increase by who knows how many times. In an instant, it was reborn and became a ritual implement that even they could only dream of. How could they not be shocked at the difference between what they saw and what they knew? How could they not be in disbelief? With their second stage and third stage immortal realm strength, they could not understand Luo Fan's method at all, let alone guess what kind of divine power was needed to achieve this. Therefore, they could only sigh in amazement, but they could not gain anything from it. Luo Fan changed this magic tool casually and treated it as a small matter. After changing the magic tool, he ordered his servants to bring Zhou Si and the others onto the magic tool. This time, the cloud had a radius of a few hundred feet, which was 100 times larger than the previous one. Although it was still not too spacious, it was completely enough to accommodate Luo Fan and the others. After Zhou Si and the others boarded the cloud, they felt that it was extremely soft and comfortable. They even felt that standing there for millions of years without moving was an extremely blissful thing. However, they did not spend too much time enjoying this comfort. After getting on the cloud, Luo Fan began to get busy. Zhou Si directly took out tables and chairs, various kinds of ambrosia, fruits, and snacks for Luo Fan to sit down and enjoy. Naturally, these are not what Luo Fan needed. However, since Zhou Si and the others were slaves, it was not good for them to sit and do nothing. Luo Fan smiled slightly and did not care much. He directly sat on the chair and enjoyed the ambrosia, snacks, and fruits prepared by Zhou Si. After this cloud was reforged by Luo Fan, it already had a very strong spiritual nature. It was almost like the automatic machines in Luo Fan's previous life. As long as the destination was set at the beginning, it could automatically go there, and it could even make various necessary responses according to the situation. And just now, when Luo Fan was refining this magic tool, he had directly entered his first destination into the magic tool. At this moment, there was no need for him to do anything. This magic tool could naturally take them to that destination. Because of this, Luo Fan did not need to do anything along the way, nor did he need to hand over the task of controlling the magic tool to Zhou Si and the others. Instead, he could enjoy it leisurely and did not need to care about the problem of walking. When Luo Fan, Zhou Si, and the others rode the magic tool and left Nanman, somewhere in Nanman, a voice suddenly sounded. "They're finally gone. That's great. I didn't expect that I could escape from an immortal above the 6th stage. My luck is really good. This existence." He was the city lord of Nanman and also the strongest existence in Nanman. He was already a peak 3rd stage immortal. He was only one step away from reaching the 4th stage. It would not be surprising if he broke through the shackles in the next moment and reached the 4th stage. This realm was already at the peak of the golden immortal realm in the primordial world. In the entire primordial world, apart from the few primordial immortals under Luo Fan's tutelage, he was the strongest existence. But in the Tianyuan Great World, in the outer area, this realm, this kind of strength was only in the lower middle level, at most in the middle level. One could imagine the situation of such an existence in the outer area, a world where the strong preyed on the weak. It was precisely because of this situation that the city lord of Nanman was extremely cautious and careful. He carefully dealt with all creatures that appeared in Nanman that could threaten him. At this time, Luo Fan was at the peak of the disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven. In the eyes of the Tianyuan Great World, even a 7th stage immortal was tens of millions of times stronger than a 3rd stage immortal. The two were basically two completely different worlds. It could be said that if Luo Fan wanted to, he didn't even need to make a move. As long as he had a thought, as long as he revealed a little bit of unfavorable thoughts, he could even directly turn him into powder. His soul would fly away, and his body would disappear. Under such circumstances, how could he not be aware that Luo Fan had appeared in Nanman City for more than 10 days? However, being aware of the arrival of Luo Fan didn't make him feel at ease. Instead, it made him almost live in hot water for more than 10 days. He was only a third-stage immortal, to make him completely unable to sense the depth of the existence. It had to be at least 3 stages stronger than him. Therefore, when he knew of the existence of Luo Fan, he understood that in front of Luo Fan, he was almost not even an ant. His life could be said to be in the palm of the other party's hand. As long as the other party wanted to, he could easily completely extinguish his millions of years of life. According to the law of the jungle in the outer domain, there was no protection for him like how he protected the other creatures in the southern barbaric city. Although he had almost no protection for the creatures in the southern barbaric city, it was precisely because of his existence that those first, second, and even third-level immortals didn't dare to wreak havoc in the southern barbaric city without fear. But he didn't have this kind of luck. Without the protection of a more powerful creature, any creature that was more powerful than him could do anything to him without any consequences as long as it was willing. Under such circumstances, every day that Luo Fan stayed in Nanman City was one more day of torment for him. It made him feel that he was between life and death, and at any moment, a big hand could fall from the sky and crush him. Therefore, in the past 10 days, although he knew of the existence of Luo Fan, he didn't come to look for Luo Fan at all. He didn't want to get any benefits from Luo Fan, nor did he want to make friends with him or even use him. Therefore, in the past 10 days, Luo Fan almost felt that the Nanman City in front of him was almost a lawless area. It was a place where there was no city lord at all. And at this moment, Luo Fan had finally left. To him, this was like a huge stone that had been pressing down on his heart, directly moving away the barrier that had been covering all of his vitality. How could he not feel relaxed and rejoice? I really can't stay in Nanman City any longer. I originally thought that being the city lord here was a good job. I didn't expect to encounter such a powerful existence. If a few more come, my life may be gone. The city lord of Nanman City thought in his own city lord's mansion. In the end, he made up his mind and decided to leave Nanman City. Although there was no absolute powerful existence in this wild continent. After all, as long as there were living beings, there would be disputes. There would be winners and losers, and naturally, there would be rulers. Therefore, there were many forces on this wild continent that divided and occupied the entire land. And this Nanman City had the void gate that connected to the inner area, so naturally, it was impossible to let it go. Therefore, it was also ruled by this force. The reason why the city lord came here to be the city lord was also because he was sent here. Of course, he was also very happy to be sent here to be the city lord, and he also got a lot of benefits from this place. It was natural that there were benefits, although there would be a long interval for creatures to come from the inner area to the outer area. But after hundreds of thousands of years, during the period when the city lord of Nanman City was in office, there were many creatures that came from the inner area. And as the city lord of Nanman City, as the most powerful existence in Nanman City, the best things, of course, fell into his hands. And the creatures that came from the inner area, unless they were as powerful as Luo Fan and didn't care much about the dangers of the outer area, they must be very well prepared. An existence that had many good things. In this way, how could the benefits he got in hundreds of thousands of years be little? With so much benefits and the little danger encountered, this kind of life for the creatures of the outer area was simply a dream. The city lord of Nanman City was very satisfied with his life before, and even thought that he would live like this forever until he broke through to the third stage immortal realm. Then he would change to a more profitable, better, and safer place to be the city lord. But it wasn't until 10 days ago when he encountered Luo Fan, who was so powerful that he couldn't resist, that he understood that the safety he thought was so fragile. It was so fragile that as long as an unexpected creature came from the inner area, it would be enough to make his life in the hands of others. And from then on, he wouldn't be able to control himself. This naturally made him want to retreat, and he had the idea of moving away from this Nan-Man city. The strongest person in this Nan-Man city was only a third stage immortal, so he didn't have any backing to protect him here. In other places, he wasn't the strongest, but as long as he relied on a stronger person, it would be safer than here. It was because of this consideration that he had that kind of idea. Since he already had an idea, the city lord of Nan-Man City naturally began to move around, making connections and applying for a transfer. There was no need to mention this. Although Luo Fan was powerful and had an amazing mind, he wouldn't waste his energy on a creature he didn't know at all. Naturally, he didn't know that he didn't say anything. He didn't do anything, but the city lord of Nan-Man City was so scared that he didn't dare to stay in Nan-Man any longer and hurriedly applied for a transfer. However, even if he knew, he would at most look down on the city lord of Nan-Man City's weak will and conclude that it would be extremely difficult for him to break through to the fourth stage, but he wouldn't feel too much. At this moment, the cloud-like magic tool that had been reforged by Luo Fan carried them and their servants along the route that he had previously set at a speed that wasn't considered slow even for a third stage immortal Ba Yuan. This cloud was a flying magic tool. In addition to its extremely fast flying speed, it could isolate the inside from the outside, nourish, and draw vitality. These were only the most basic powers. Therefore, on this cloud, they didn't feel any impact from the rapid advancement. They only felt as if they were in a fixed cave with nothing to do. If it weren't for the constantly changing light and shadow outside, perhaps they wouldn't even know whether they were advancing or not. Luo Fan enjoyed the ambrosia and fruit snacks along the way, while quietly refining the power in his body and deducing all kinds of wonderful methods. At this time, he was just a disbanded celestial of the great, all-embracing heaven. Not to mention, compared to his body at the peak of the true path of the great, all-embracing heaven, even compared to his body at the first stage of the three realms of the great, all-embracing heaven, he was far inferior. According to the Tianyuan Great World's method of dividing realms, he was at most a fourth-stage immortal, but he wasn't even in the top three realms. In front of an existence like Ba Yuan, he was naturally omnipotent, but if he met a real expert, such as a seventh or eighth-stage immortal realm cultivator, his strength would be stretched thin, and it would be difficult for him to truly suppress everything. It was precisely because of this that, in addition to experiencing all kinds of things in the Wasteland continent, it was more important for him to create a cultivation method that was suitable for the Tianyuan Great World, that was comparable to the Dao Fruit Great Way, so that his cultivation realm could be as close as possible to his original body in the untainted land. Only then could he truly obtain a considerable amount of freedom in the Tianyuan Great World. Only then could he not worry too much, and he wouldn't feel his hands and feet bound when he encountered a slightly stronger cultivator. Once a creature in the Tianyuan Great World cultivated a certain cultivation method, its rank in the future was completely determined. In the future, without a great opportunity, it would be difficult to change the rank. A cultivation method that could completely transform a cultivator's power, a cultivator's soul, a cultivator's physical body, and even everything else, but at a higher rank, was obviously such a great opportunity. Therefore, as long as a cultivator changed to a cultivation method that met the above conditions, he would naturally be able to increase his rank, just like Ba Yuan had done before. However, this seemed simple, but it was actually extremely difficult to encounter. After all, in a world like the great Tianyuan world that had developed the cultivation civilization to such a flourishing state, any cultivation method must have gone through countless years of development and perfection. Generally speaking, it would have reached the limit of what it could achieve. In other words, generally speaking, the rank of a cultivation method that could be reached was the highest rank that could be reached in that cultivation direction. If one wanted a higher rank cultivation method, they would usually cultivate in another direction, a direction that was more compatible with the Great Way. It was almost impossible to create a higher rank cultivation method in the same direction. Chapter 772. Because of these problems, it was extremely rare for someone to change their cultivation method to increase their cultivation level in the Great Tianyuan world. That's right. Unless it's someone who doesn't have a complete master and the cultivation technique isn't complete, the body is a fragment taken from a higher grade cultivation technique. However, this was not a problem for Luo Fan. The cultivation method that Luo Fan cultivated was created by himself through his understanding of the rules, laws, and even the great Tao of the great heaven and earth of Tianyuan. However, it had not been perfected over countless years in the great heaven and earth of Tianyuan. Therefore, it could only be regarded as an imperfect method. Such a technique naturally had a huge room for improvement. Therefore, as long as he went deeper into his own cultivation path and continued to complete the 811th Eternal Forest, he would definitely be able to raise this technique to the upper third grade. This would also raise his cultivation realm to the upper third grade, reaching a level comparable to his body. However, this was only a prospect. In order to truly achieve that goal, Luo Fan would need to spend an endless amount of effort to perfect his own cultivation method and to comprehend the profound mysteries of the great Tao of Tianyuan Great World. Only in this way could he truly perfect that cultivation method to the upper 3 grades. Otherwise, even if his cultivation direction was correct, he would only be able to wander around the middle 3 grades. There would be an incredible gap between the power of his divine ability and that of his body. On the other hand, if he couldn't increase his rank, then even if he cultivated to the peak of the golden immortal realm, the difficulty of becoming a saint would definitely be unimaginably enormous, and it could practically be said to be practically impossible. Because of this, Luo Fan was working hard to comprehend the mysteries of the great heaven primordial world and perfect his own cultivation method. At this time, Luo Fan was cultivating 2 cultivation methods. One was to change the nature of one's existence, allowing one's existence to completely conform to the great heaven and earth cultivation method. The other was to change the body, allowing one's body to completely conform to the great heaven and earth cultivation method of the 811th Eternal Forest. Seriously speaking, these 2 cultivation methods were not cultivation methods to raise one's own cultivation level. It was just a technique that allowed him to merge with the great Tianyuan world. Because of this, Luo Fan was still at the peak of the disbanded celestial of the great, all-embracing heaven. He did not even manage to raise his cultivation level to a level that was compatible with his body, let alone continue to rise and pursue the legendary path to sainthood. However, even so, at this time he had also stepped into the peak of the 3 middle grades, becoming a 4th stage, 7th stage immortal. From this, it could be seen how mysterious the 2 techniques were. Even if they were not specifically used to increase one's cultivation level, they were still able to surpass the cultivation techniques of most of the major forces in the great Tianyuan world, and were only second to the cultivation techniques created by the sages. Luo Fan had already cultivated those 2 cultivation techniques to the depth of his life. In fact, he was only 1 step away from surpassing time and space and projecting himself into the past and the future. It was obvious how great the impact this had on him was. When he began to think about his own cultivation method, he would naturally think of these 2 cultivation methods. He would naturally draw his thoughts towards these 2 methods and gradually change the direction of his thoughts. This could be said to be a very troublesome problem. Because of this, he could not jump out of the rut of these 2 cultivation methods. So he could not start anew and create a completely new cultivation method for his own cultivation. However, if this problem was looked at from another perspective, it was also a very fortunate situation. Those 2 cultivation methods had been derived by Luo Fan from the chi of the great Tianyuan world in reverse, but they were most compatible with the great way of the great Tianyuan world. That was to say, these 2 cultivation methods represented a direction that was extremely close to the source of cultivation in the great Tianyuan world. From this point of view, If he continued to perfect them in this direction, it would not be difficult to obtain the top 3 cultivation methods, as long as he worked hard enough and had enough wisdom. Therefore, the direction of his thoughts influenced by these 2 cultivation methods was equivalent to constantly guiding him to the correct direction, the direction closest to the source of cultivation in the great Tianyuan world. This was, of course, luck. For Luo Fan, creating ordinary cultivation methods was something that could be done with just a thought. It was just like the cultivation method that he had taught Bai Yuan before. With just a slight thought, he could obtain thousands of types of cultivation methods. However, the top 3 cultivation methods were so precious that even sages were unwilling to spread them. Naturally, it was not easy to create them. At the very least, it was not easy for the current Luo Fan. Naturally, he could not create a cultivation method with just a thought like he did for Bai Yuan. While they were hurrying on their way, Luo Fan spent endless energy, but he only had a rough idea of the cultivation method. He had not even formed a rough outline. However, even with these ideas, Luo Fan felt that the future had become much brighter, and he felt that his path forward had become much clearer. After the cloud-like magic tool was refined by Luo Fan, its speed had reached an extremely shocking level. In a few days, he had traveled hundreds of millions of kilometers and arrived next to an ancient forest. This was one of the nearly 100 dangerous places in the wasteland world that could not be shown on the map. The ancient forest of the great Tianyuan world was completely different from the ancient forest of the untainted land. No matter how ancient the untainted land was, its history was still there. In terms of the history of the world that had existed for hundreds of Yuan Wei, the ancient forest had existed for a very limited period of time. However, the great Tianyuan world was completely different from the untainted land. The history of the great Tianyuan world had been around for trillions of years. To be more specific, it had exceeded the limit of what could be described with numbers. With such a long time, it was easy to imagine how ancient it was. At this moment, the ancient forest below Luo Fan and the others was extremely ancient. It had existed for trillions of years. Just standing outside the ancient forest, there was an incomparably ancient and vicissitude aura. Even Luo Fan felt the shortness of his existence in front of this forest and the insignificance of the time he had experienced. At this moment, Zhou Si and the others finally changed their expressions and exclaimed, "Master, do you want to enter the eternal forest?" Zhou Si and the others were native cultivators of the outer domain, so they were naturally not dabblers like Bai Yuan. They were very clear about the many dangers in the wild continent. The eternal forest was only a few 100 million miles away from the southern wilderness where they were entrenched. Compared to the vast wild continent, they were almost closely interdependent. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for them to not know what the ancient forest below them was. While they were hurrying along, they sensed the direction of the cloud. They could vaguely guess that Luo Fan's destination was this ancient forest. But when they really came out of the forest, they really dispelled all hope and finally confirmed that this was indeed Luo Fan's destination. For a moment, they couldn't help but be shocked to the extreme. They even forgot the hierarchy between master and servant and shouted in horror. It could be seen how afraid they were of the so-called eternal forest. That's right, it's here. Luo Fan had already recovered from the thoughts of creating a cultivation method. He didn't care about the exclamations of Zhou Si and the others. He just smiled and said, absolutely not. Absolutely not." When Zhou Si heard this, he couldn't help but exclaim. Even his body started to tremble slightly. "Why not?" Luo Fan said with a smile. "Master doesn't know, but the eternal forest has existed for an unknown amount of time. It is said that there are ancient divine trees that have grown for trillions of years and have supreme abilities. They reject everything from the outside world. Even if a rank 9 immortal enters, they won't be able to leave. It's a land of death. If you enter, you'll almost certainly die." Zhou Si shouted in horror. "Divine trees that have grown for trillions of years?" When Luo Fan heard this, his eyes lit up. He was all too clear about the concept of trillions of years. A tree could exist for trillions of years. Even if it didn't cultivate, the power of its abilities must have grown to an incredible level. This made him very interested. After all, he came to the great Tianyuan world and saw countless experts. He saw what it was like to have a higher realm than him. He hoped that it would be of some help to his body and allow his physique Tao to increase. In this kind of situation, knowing that there was an existence that was several times stronger than him in front of him, how could he not be interested? Zhou Si's heart was filled with fear, and his observation skills were raised to the limit. He saw that Luo Fan didn't hide his expression at all. He knew that his words had the opposite effect, so he couldn't help feeling despair. Although he knew that Luo Fan's strength had reached an incredible level, and he could even easily make a lower-grade immortal become a middle-grade immortal, this kind of strength was only his conjecture after all. Compared to the various terrifying legends of the eternal forest for hundreds of millions of years, as well as the fact that every once in a while, there would be creatures entering the eternal forest but never leaving, how could he believe that Luo Fan could leave the eternal forest? What do I do? What do I do? It seems like he must go in. How should I leave? What should I do to not go in? Escape? No. Although this person can't break through the eternal forest, he is several times stronger than me. If I escape, I will be killed by him. What should I do? What should I do? This was the only thought that kept reverberating in Zhou Si's mind. Instantly, he began to sweat profusely. Xi and AI and the others had similar expressions as Zhou Si and were even more unbearable. There were even some people who were trembling and couldn't even stand straight. In comparison, Ba Yuan, who didn't know anything about the eternal forest, was much calmer. Although his face was filled with hesitation and fear, it was still considered normal. Luo Fan finally noticed their expressions and couldn't help laughing. He didn't care too much about their fear, and he didn't look down on their thoughts. Being afraid of danger was not a shameful matter, especially when they knew that they would die. There was no need to look down on them. He believed that if he forcefully asked them to follow him into the eternal forest, they would definitely yield. After all, he was very strong. Dying now, or waiting for a future that seemed like death but still had a trace of hope, anyone with a bit of intelligence would know what to choose. However, he didn't have this kind of plan. He had a bit of confidence that he could escape from the eternal forest. He also had confidence that if they followed him into the eternal forest, they would be able to obtain a large amount of training and obtain a large amount of benefits. But Zhou Si and the others were only his servants for 3,000 years and not his disciples. Even if he brought them in, he wouldn't protect them and there was no need to train them. Therefore, he had seen their performance. He revealed a faint smile and said, "There's no need to be afraid. You don't have to follow me into the forest. If you don't want to enter, it's fine as long as you wait outside for a bit. I won't force you." Ba Yuan is willing to follow Master inside. Luo Fan finished speaking. Ba Yuan immediately said in a firm voice. Although everyone had an understanding of Luo Fan's strength, only Ba Yuan had the most direct understanding of Luo Fan's strength. He knew just how strong Luo Fan was, so he had the most confidence in Luo Fan. Therefore, even if he had heard about the dangers of the forest from Zhou Si, he still had full confidence in Luo Fan without knowing it directly. He believed that as long as Luo Fan was willing, he would be able to walk through the forest like it was flat ground. Therefore, he directly suppressed the fear in his heart and expressed his position without any hesitation. When Luo Fan heard this, he nodded and said, "If you are willing to enter with me, then that's naturally the best. What about you guys? We'll wait for Master outside. Entering will really cross the bottom line of our fear. We really don't dare to enter. I hope Master can forgive us." Zhou Si and the others' fear decreased a bit, and they looked at each other. Zhou Si replied with a bitter smile. As a rank 2 immortal, Zhou Si's mind was not ordinary, and his cultivation of Tao heart was not weak. Therefore, he did not hide his fear at all. He did not try to find a dignified reason like how mortals would when they retreated. He directly expressed to Luo Fan that he was afraid and did not dare to enter. Luo Fan smiled and admired Zhou Si a little more. Though he did not really care about Zhou Si and the others and did not care about their thoughts of life and death, he did not cut off his emotions after all. Therefore, He naturally had different opinions about Zhou Ci's behavior. With this kind of admiration, he pointed. With a casual point of his finger, a speck of light flew out of his hand and arrived in front of Zhou Ci, where it condensed into a small, sparkling, and translucent ball of light. This ball of light was the size of a fist. Light flowed on its surface, and there seemed to be some kind of mysterious existence swimming on top of it. This ball corresponds to my life. If I die, no matter how far away I am, or how much time and space we are separated by, this ball will definitely collapse. Wait here. If this ball collapses, then the promise of 3,000 years will be considered null and void, and you can leave, Luo Fan said. When Zhou Ci and the others heard Luo Fan's words, they could not help but be shocked. What they were shocked about was not the mysterious function of this little ball. In fact, this little ball's function was not strange at all. Almost every power in the Sky Origin world had a similar technique like this. What they were shocked about was Luo Fan's method. They were only his slaves, and they would only be slaves for 3,000 years. Even if they did not have this little ball, they would only waste 3,000 years at most. When the time was up, they would naturally recover. So why would they need to control Luo Fan's life and death situation? However, even so, Luo Fan actually handed over the small ball that was related to his life and death situation to them. This kind of breadth of mind, this kind of attitude, had already completely exceeded their imagination, causing them to simply not dare to believe what they had seen. For a moment, they couldn't help but open their mouths. They almost wanted to change their previous decision and follow Luo Fan into the eternal forest. However, this was only almost. In the end, their rationality prevailed, and they suppressed the fluctuations in their hearts, closing their mouths. Many thanks for Master's consideration. In the end, it was Zhou Ci who reluctantly spoke. Luo Fan did not care about the changes in their hearts. The reason why he gave them this ball of light that was related to his life and death situation was not to influence their decision, but rather because he appreciated Zhou Ci's honesty. He was using this method to express his approval. It didn't matter to him if they changed their minds, and he wouldn't care if they didn't change their minds. Therefore, he only nodded and landed the cloud on the ground. He and the others got off the cloud and opened the Universe Creator sleeve to collect the magic tool. After collecting the magic tool, he didn't say anything else and brought Bai Yuan to the eternal forest in front of them. Behind them, Zhou Ci and the others knelt on the ground and bowed towards Luo Fan's back, but they didn't dare say anything. They no longer had any fear at this moment. Their faces were filled with relief, but there were traces of shame mixed in. This shame was very irrational. After all, there was nothing wrong with their choice. For the so-called master and servant relationship to risk their lives, this was an incomparably stupid thing to do. There was absolutely nothing wrong with their decision. However, this kind of shame was natural because it appeared after Luo Fan gave them the ball of light. They all faintly felt sorry for Luo Fan in their hearts. Are we really doing the right thing? Xian AI leisurely sighed after Luo Fan's figure disappeared. What does it matter if it's right or wrong? Do you think it was easy for us to cultivate to this point? It's not like we don't know about the dangers of the eternal forest. Are we really going to throw away our lives? Dian Chung sighed. No matter what, we're sorry for this matter, that's for sure. Another female rank 1 immortal, Qi Yao, spoke in a very low mood. Hearing this, the others couldn't help but nod, clearly agreeing with this sentence. Although they had only been Luo Fan's servants for a dozen or so days, and they were forced to be slaves, none of them felt that this sentence was too abrupt and that this kind of behavior was cheap from a certain point of view. This was also due to Luo Fan's charm. To be continued. Chapter 773. Luo Fan didn't care about what they were doing. First published at this moment, he had already crashed into the eternal forest. That's right, he crashed into it, not walked into it. It was unknown how long the eternal forest had existed on the wild continent, but it was at least 1 trillion years. Time, on the other hand, was an indescribably mysterious existence. When the time of existence exceeded a certain limit, all sorts of inconceivable changes would occur. It was the same for this forest. Because it had existed for such a long time, countless beings had lived, reproduced, and died here. Countless trees had absorbed the essence of heaven and earth to strengthen themselves. So this eternal forest was completely different from normal forests. It was even different from normal ancient forests. The existence of the 812th ecology of the forest had changed the rules and principles of the great heaven primordial world. It had even caused the great Tao of the great heaven primordial world to slightly distort in this area. As a result, it had become slightly different from the outside world. However, for cultivators, it was an extremely crucial difference. This change made it seem as if the eternal forest had been separated from the great heaven primordial world. It was almost like it had become its own world, its own world. Due to the wonders of the eternal forest, there was an invisible barrier at the border between the eternal forest and the outside world. This barrier did not block anything from entering or exiting, but it isolated the laws and laws inside and outside. Therefore, if Luo Fan and Ba Yuan wanted to enter, they couldn't just walk in. They could only ram their way in. The moment they passed through the barrier, both of them felt as though they had traveled through time and space and arrived at another world. This feeling was very strange, allowing Ba Yuan, who didn't know much about the eternal forest, to finally have a direct understanding of it. Although his confidence in Luo Fan did not waver because of this, he still became a lot more cautious. As for Luo Fan, although he already knew that the eternal forest was not simple, this change was still out of his expectations. The 812th ecology made his heart even more excited. A forest could exist for trillions of years. This was a miracle. It was unimaginable in the untainted land. Even if he was in the Wuji Palace, he could not protect a forest for such a long time. Therefore, as for what kind of mysteries of forest that had existed for such a long time, he was unable to deduce it out of thin air. After he crossed the boundary, the ancient aura rose explosively by countless times, and it practically covered the heavens and the earth as it filled his mind, causing him to feel as if he was infected by this aura. He felt as if he had already experienced everything, and there was nothing else in the world that could interest him. With a thought from Luo Fan, this feeling disappeared in an instant. With his Tao heart and soul, how could his thoughts be completely changed by just a wave of aura? He looked around and saw that the forest in front of him seemed to have changed a little compared to the outside world, but it was only a small change. However, it didn't look much different from the outside world. There were tall and short trees in the forest, big and small. That tall tree even had a diameter of several hundred feet. It was almost like a huge mountain lying in front of them. The short trees were not even as tall as a person, and compared to the tall trees, there was a world of difference. However, there weren't many trees that were this extreme. Most of the trees were around 100 feet in diameter. This kind of situation was within Luo Fan's expectations. This was a forest full of life. It wasn't a wood field that had lost its vitality. Therefore, the trees here were old and new. They naturally grew and multiplied, and there were naturally differences in the size and height of the trees. Luo Fan casually walked forward. The further he went, the more obvious the difference from the outside world became. Only this difference was very subtle, and even he couldn't see what kind of difference it was. He couldn't instantly understand the reason for this difference. Of course, this didn't disappoint him. He entered the forest to see things he didn't understand. If everything could be seen with a glance and understood with a glance, why would there be a need to come here? It was this kind of deepening difference that allowed him to understand that it was impossible to see the secrets of the forest from the outside world. What he saw from the outside world was a strange and distorted illusion. Only by personally entering the forest would he be able to see the forest clearly and wouldn't make a mistake. From the map he bought, the eternal forest had a circumference of 300 million miles. Such a large area, compared to the great heaven origin world, and even compared to the wild continent, it was just a small dot. However, for Cultivator, it was more than enough to explore. Even Luo Fan couldn't treat the eternal forest as a small place. Even if he could cross this 300 million mile distance with just a thought, it was still the same. After all, This was the eternal forest where the rules and laws had changed, and even the grand Tao had been distorted. How could it be compared to a normal place? Other than the trees in the eternal forest, there were also countless animals living in the forest. Among them, there were even unimaginably powerful existences. At this moment, Luo Fan had just stepped into the forest, and he could faintly feel that there were definitely beings at the 7th rank of the immortal realm and above in the depths of the forest. However, the eternal forest had changed the rules and laws and distorted the grand Tao, so he couldn't fully use his senses. Adding on the fact that those beings seemed to be well-versed in the way of restraint, there was almost no aura leaking out. Thus, Luo Fan could only faintly feel the existence of those powerful beings, but he didn't know where they were or how many there were. Taking a deep breath, a kind of Hotian origin chi filled with vitality surged in. After being purified thousands of times, it finally turned into the power in Luo Fan's body. The Hotian origin chi is a bit richer than the outside world, and it has a strange vitality that can promote the vitality of living beings and even has the ability to prolong life. In an instant, Luo Fan understood the difference between the origin chi in the forest and the outside world. And this was only the edge of the eternal forest. The deeper he went into the forest, the greater the difference would be and the richer the vitality would be. From this, it could be seen how wonderful the depths of the forest were. Outsiders, this is not a place you should come to. You still have a chance to leave, but if you go any further, you will be forever trapped in the eternal forest, unable to leave again. At this moment, a dignified voice filled with endless vicissitudes entered Luo Fan and Ba Yuan's ears. Ba Yuan was shocked when he heard this voice. He looked around, but he couldn't find the source of the voice. Luo Fan naturally wouldn't be like Ba Yuan. The moment he heard the voice, he found the source of the voice. It was coming from a giant tree that was over 400 meters in diameter. What kind of concept was 400 meters in diameter? Even if 500-600 normal people spread their hands in a row, they still wouldn't be able to compare to it. How grand would a giant tree with a diameter of 400 meters be? It could be imagined just how tall it was. That tree towered into the clouds, almost reaching hundreds of thousands of meters in height. Its branches and leaves covered an area of several tens of thousands of meters. However, its branches and leaves were not luxuriant. Instead, they were sparsely spread. Although they occupied a large area, they did not block much sunlight. It didn't cause the surrounding trees to lose their living space. Around this large tree, there were many small trees that were several hundred meters in diameter that had taken root. These small trees had lush branches and leaves. There were only a few tenacious grasses growing below them, but they weren't as broad as the large tree from before. In the areas that the small trees didn't cover, there were even smaller trees growing. Just like this, it formed a system of large and small circles. And the larger the tree, the more vines there were on its body. The ancient and vicissitudes of life it gave off were even denser. Following that voice, chirping sounds came from the trees one by one. Following that, tens of thousands of birds flew out of the trees and flew into the depths of the forest. I wonder what your excellency's name is. Luo Fan asked with a faint smile. While he was asking this question, he kept looking at the 400-meter-wide tree. His eyes didn't wander, so anyone could tell who he was talking to. Outsider, although it's very surprising that you can find me, you can't reverse this rule with your strength. If you don't leave, you will be imprisoned for eternity. What choice do you have? Decide for yourself. That voice sounded again. It was still unknown where it came from, but those words clearly showed that Luo Fan's guess wasn't wrong. That voice really did come from that tree. And it was only at this time that Ba Yuan discovered that this tree wasn't an ordinary tree. He could even faintly feel a kind of pressure from the tree. It was a kind of pressure that could only be felt from a cultivator whose strength far surpassed his own. This kind of pressure made him instantly understand that the power possessed by the giant tree was very likely not something he could resist. For a moment, he couldn't help feeling a sense of fear in his heart. He even carefully looked at Luo Fan and had the delusion of making Luo Fan listen to his advice and leave the eternal forest. Of course, that was a delusion. When Luo Fan decided to leave, he knew that there were many mysteries in the eternal forest. There were many taboos, so he had already mentally prepared himself. How could he be dispelled by just a few words from that tree, give up his plan and leave? Therefore, he only smiled and said, "Many thanks for your Excellency's advice." Saying this, he walked forward without a care in the world. There weren't any obvious paths in the eternal forest, and there weren't any traces of beasts walking at the edge of the forest. So he could move forward as he pleased. His destination was the interior of the forest, but he couldn't change his general direction. At this time, he slowly walked towards the large tree. Of course, his goal wasn't the large tree, but rather the gap next to the large tree. The large tree was right in front of them, blocking the path towards the depths of the forest. The large tree was like what it said, letting Luo Fan decide. After saying that, it didn't say anything else. It was just like an ordinary ancient tree. Luo Fan wasn't too surprised by the large tree's performance. Although his perception couldn't be used to its limit in this forest, it was still a powerful perception that surpassed normal cultivators. Therefore, after the large tree spoke, he caught the aura of the large tree from that ancient and vicissitudes aura and knew the truth of the large tree. The large tree wasn't a cultivator who cultivated cultivation methods, nor was an immortal like Ba Yuan. It was just a tree. However, it was an ancient tree that had lived for at least tens of millions of years and had absorbed countless essences of heaven and earth. Due to the long period of absorption, it had unknowingly become powerful. Unknowingly, it had become powerful, and unknowingly, it possessed the divine ability power that countless cultivators dreamed of. However, although the divine ability was powerful, it couldn't be used in battle. At most, it could only be used for defense and absorbing the essences of heaven and earth. If the divine ability's power was converted to a cultivator's cultivation realm, the ancient tree was at least a fourth-stage immortal. Moreover, it was extremely pure, at least a fourth-stage immortal of the middle three stages. Although the divine ability's power was somewhat limited, it was still close to a grand unity immortal. It wasn't something an ordinary third-stage immortal could resist. From this aspect, Ba Yuan's sense of danger was quite accurate. However, although it possessed the divine ability's power, its thoughts were extremely different from ordinary creatures. It was almost like a robot and didn't have many emotions. The words it said to Luo Fan earlier were mostly due to the restrictions of some rules. It didn't have any pity or intention to persuade him. It was purely fulfilling its mission. Therefore, it behaved this way. Luo Fan was naturally not surprised. Luo Fan and Ba Yuan quickly crossed the distance of several tens of thousands of feet. The moment they crossed the tree, Luo Fan understood why the tree said those words. Because, at that moment, he suddenly felt an indescribable change in the rules and laws around him. This change was like countless threads that entangled his body. They even entered his body, entered his mind, and entangled everything in his body, whether tangible or intangible. Due to this entanglement, he suddenly realized that the difficulty of leaving the eternal forest had increased by many times. I see. It's actually taking all living beings that step into it as a part of itself and integrating them into its ecosystem. If I want to break through this entanglement, I need to at least have the power to sever the rules. No wonder this forest can only be entered but not exited. Just this entanglement of the laws is enough to make 99% of the cultivators unable to deal with it, not to mention that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are still more difficult factors to deal with inside. Luo Fan sighed. Although he was sighing, he was even more surprised, but he didn't panic at all. He didn't despair at all. Cutting the laws, although it was hard for him to do it with his current cultivation, he could do it with his body. This also meant that this restriction wasn't permanent for him. As long as he could recover the power of his body's divine ability, it wouldn't be hard for him to break free from this entanglement. With this kind of confidence, how could he despair? Luo Fan had confidence, but Ba Yuan didn't have this kind of confidence. Although he couldn't clearly feel the changes in the laws, when he crossed the tree, even if he wanted to take a step back and leave, his body couldn't move back. With this kind of change, how could he not know that the tree's words weren't false? It really would be hard for him to leave the eternal forest. This made him feel an inexplicable fear. Although it didn't reach the point of despair, he began to secretly regret following Luo Fan into the forest. Luo Fan didn't care about Ba Yuan at all. He patted the tree beside him and laughed as he said, "It really is strange. I never thought it would be this kind of restriction. Many thanks for waking up." His words naturally didn't receive any response. That tree's way of thinking was different from normal cultivators. It was cold and indifferent, so when it didn't need to speak, it naturally wouldn't speak. And Luo Fan's words clearly didn't need to be answered, so of course there wouldn't be any response. Luo Fan didn't expect to receive an answer. After saying this, he no longer cared about the tree as he walked forward with the despairing Ba Yuan. The scene in front of him was different from where he had been before. There weren't many large trees in front of him. There were more ancient trees that were several feet in diameter and several dozen feet in diameter. Although they still looked quite large and shocking, compared to the trees outside that were several dozen feet in diameter and several hundred feet in diameter, they were many times smaller. The ancient aura that filled the entire forest was no longer seeping out from the trees, but from the ground. Although it was much denser than the places he had passed through previously, it lacked a kind of unfathomable influence. Instead, it gave off a heavy sense of support. As expected, the reproduction rate inside is several times higher than outside. Luo Fan thought to himself. At this moment, he could faintly feel some kind of mysterious and wondrous existence surging into his body from the outside world, bringing out some kind of equally mysterious existence from his body. This entry and exit didn't make him feel any discomfort. Instead, he felt that his connection with his surroundings was becoming closer. He became closer to the surrounding laws, and even the distorted Grand Tao. He was more in tune with them. This change allowed him to confirm his previous thoughts. That kind of entanglement had indeed brought him into the ecosystem of the forest, causing him to unknowingly become a part of the forest. It made it easier for him to obtain certain things from the forest, and at the same time, he was constantly contributing certain things to strengthen the forest. Chapter 774. What was even more different from the outside world was that the area in front of Luo Fan had already begun to show signs of beasts. Text first, the world in front of him had also become much wider. Apart from trees, there were also many other types of plants. Almost all kinds of exotic flowers and grasses could be found. Luo Fan naturally did not feel too much about this. After all, even if those exotic flowers and grasses were extremely rare in the Great Tianyuan world, they were only limited to the Great Tianyuan world. The Primordial world was naturally much inferior to the Great Tianyuan world in terms of quality. However, it was at the beginning of the world. Even though there were drastic changes after the Great Tribulation of the world and the number of strange creatures had decreased greatly, the trees in front of him were only the 813th most common and extremely ordinary ones in the primordial world. How could they possibly move Luo Fan? However, this was not the case in Ba Yuan's eyes. The moment the numerous exotic plants in front of him entered his eyes, Ba Yuan suddenly felt an indescribable greed surge into his heart and occupied all his thoughts. Almost any of the exotic flowers and grasses in front of him was enough to cause a bloodbath in the outside world. It was enough to cause many second and third stage immortals to bleed profusely. There were many that he had only heard of before, but had never seen before. There were even some that he had dreamed of and searched for tens of thousands of years. At this moment, these treasures appeared in front of him like weeds. Putting aside the fact that there were exotic beasts guarding them, he could even see the traces of some beasts walking over them. How could he not be shocked and greedy? At that moment, he almost forgot about his current fate. Seeing how disdainful Luo Fan was towards those treasures, he knew that Luo Fan would not care. Thus, he pounced forward without hesitation. Streams of heart fire condensed from the acupoints all over his body, and they all looked like real arms. In an instant, they turned into a 1,000-armed monster that covered the many treasures. In an instant, the ground in front of him was empty. The 813th tree of wonders, as long as it was a slightly valuable plant, it was pulled out by the arms condensed from Heartfire. It was directly sent into his storage space. As a third-stage immortal, it was not difficult to open up a stable space on some items. Thus, it was impossible for an 8th-stage immortal to not have any storage space. Luo Fan looked at Ba Yuan's starving appearance and shook his head with a sigh. He found it both funny and infuriating. This was only the edge of the eternal forest, no matter how good the things here were. It was just the worst in the eternal forest. If they recklessly grabbed it now, where would there be space to store the good things in the future? However, he did not say anything. These were only minor details. There was no need for him to say more. Ba Yuan would soon understand the truth. He smiled faintly and walked forward. The deeper he went, the stronger his connection with his surroundings became. Closer and closer. He didn't even need to use his perception to feel the mysterious breathing of the surrounding trees and hear the mysterious sounds coming from the surrounding trees. This is almost a world of trees. Luo Fan sighed. There were traces of walking beasts in the surroundings. There were also the auras of powerful walking beasts, but none of this could change the fact that the trees were the main force. All the rules, laws, and even the distorted grand Tao revolved around the trees, with the trees as the center. Or it could be said that the trees were the main characters of the rules, laws, and grand Tao. Their status was like the humans of the Great Sky Origin World and the humans of the Great Ancient World. With a slight thought, he took a step forward and his figure appeared several tens of thousands of feet in the air, quietly floating there. This position was already close to the top of the forest. With a glance, there were only a few scattered trees that could reach this height. Therefore, from his current position, he could roughly see what the top of the forest looked like. This eternal forest looked to be 300 million miles wide from the outside. However, due to the changes and distortions of the laws, and even the Great Tao, the area was not just 300 million miles in circumference. Instead, it had expanded by 100 times, reaching 3 billion miles in circumference. The circumference was the scale of the area. For example, if a rectangle was expanded by 100 times, its side would naturally be expanded by 10 times. With such a vast area, even if it was an ordinary place without any mysteries, Luo Fan still wouldn't be able to see through it at a glance. Not to mention that there were countless powerful creatures in this forest and countless astonishing auras entrenched there. There was even a divine tree that seemed to have existed for trillions of years. It was even more impossible for him to see through it at a glance. Standing there, all he could see was a boundless sea of trees. The countless treetops stood side by side like waves, undulating up and down. It was incomparably grand and shocking. Looking up, the sky above him had a huge change compared to the outside world. The sky seemed to only be several tens of thousands of miles high, but it was not as high as the sky outside. It was incomparably strange and mysterious. In the sky, there was a massive sun that didn't look much different from the outside world. It was also emitting boundless light and heat, along with boundless radiance that filled the sky and earth, nourishing the plants in this vast forest. Luo Fan slightly frowned. With a thought, his eyes flashed with boundless light. In an instant, millions of thoughts flashed in his mind, and in the blink of an eye, he had already deduced the mysteries within. This sun looked the same as the sun outside, but in fact, this sun was not the same as the sun outside. Or it could be said that this sun was not even a real sun. It was just a projection of the sun outside. All of the power and mysteries contained within were the same as the sun in the outside world. But in fact, the power of the sun in the outside world was guided into the mysterious world formed by the eternal forest through a mysterious method. Faintly, Luo Fan could even feel that there was a deep and unfathomable will sleeping within the sun. That will was not the will of the sun, but a kind of will that emitted a kind of wood vitality. It was obvious that it was the will of some kind of tree. That will was so vast that even Luo Fan's body could not compare to it. But its nature was special. It seemed to have lost its activity and could only continue to sleep. It seemed like it could not even think freely. It also seemed like it could only think in an incomparably slow manner. Perhaps this is the so-called tree god, Luo Fan carefully deduced, and after dozens of breaths, he finally saw the outline of the will. That will did not have any form. It was just a mysterious existence without any form. But when its nature was intertwined, it would naturally project a certain form in the mind of a living being. The outline that Luo Fan had glimpsed was precisely like this. In his mind, that was a tree. It was an incomparably large tree that could fill the world. It filled the world. It was unknown how tall it was, but it was unknown how big it was. This tree's shape was very mysterious. It seemed like it had gathered all the characteristics of trees in Luo Fan's knowledge, but it also seemed like it had extracted all the characteristics of trees in his knowledge. It was impossible to determine what kind of tree it was. He only knew that it was a tree, and it could only be a tree. The appearance of this situation made this will not seem like it belonged to a living being. Rather, it seemed like it was formed from the will of countless trees. It was like the faith of countless trees, and the faith was placed in a god. Therefore, this was more like the tree god. Thinking of this, Luo Fan felt an indescribable admiration for the eternal forest in his heart. He was even more glad that he had entered the eternal forest. Just what he saw now was an eye-opener for him. If he didn't enter the forest, how could he have this kind of harvest? How could he know that a forest would have this kind of mysteriousness after accumulating for so many years? Guessing the source of the will, Luo Fan had a deeper understanding of the sun's projection. That projection, it must have been formed from the accumulation of countless years and the will of countless trees. That was even more vast and powerful than Luo Fan's body. If he could refine it, whether it was refining or fusing with it, there would be large benefits. But Luo Fan did not have any thoughts of refining it. It was not just that if this would disappeared. The projection of the sun would not be stable, and it would cause serious damage to the entire forest. More importantly, he could feel that there were countless powerful protective wills placed on this will. Although he could not feel it right now, if he dared to touch that will, he would anger many powerful creatures and suffer the wrath of the many auras entrenched within. And among those auras, there were many that were stronger than Luo Fan. If he stirred up the wrath of those auras, it could even threaten his life. With this kind of will, it was clearly not worth it to take this kind of danger to his life. Therefore, Luo Fan looked at the sun for a while before revealing a faint smile. He no longer cared about the sun and released his perception to search the surroundings. After a while, his eyes lit up and he locked onto a certain place. He took a step forward and arrived at the place he was originally at. Looking up, he discovered that the dense vegetation around him had completely disappeared, leaving behind only a bare ground. Even a thick layer of fallen leaves had almost all disappeared. As for Bai Yuan, he was still excitedly searching for the strange flowers and plants in front of him. In such a situation, how could Luo Fan not know what was going on? He could not help but laugh. "Let's go." Luo Fan could not be bothered to talk to him. He directly called out to him and unhurriedly walked towards the location he had locked onto. This time, the speed at which he walked was not as slow as before. Because he had a target, he covered dozens of feet with each step. It looked like he was neither fast nor slow, but in reality, his speed was quite fast. From the time the words left his mouth to the time Bai Yuan reacted, he had already become a small that hidden by the trees. When Bai Yuan saw this, although he was extremely reluctant, he could only stop searching with a constipated expression and chase after Luo Fan. After all, Luo Fan's speed was neither fast nor slow. Any cultivator at the 7th or 8th stage of the mortal realm could easily catch up to him. Naturally, Bai Yuan, who was at the 3rd stage of the immortal realm, would have no problem catching up. The location Luo Fan had locked onto was about 5 kilometers away from here, but it was not too far. Before long, he had already brought Bai Yuan to their destination. Along the way, Luo Fan didn't say anything. He just casually looked at the scenery around him and sensed the mysteries of the forest. Although he didn't gain much, he had a deeper understanding of the characteristics of the forest. On the other hand, Bai Yuan's journey was extremely torturous. He felt that every step he took required a huge amount of willpower. He felt that every step forward was like a piece of flesh being cut off from his heart. That was because he realized that the place he was passing by was filled with a strange aura. Almost everywhere was filled with treasures that were several times more precious and rare than the exotic flowers and herbs he had plundered before. These treasures were right under his feet and right beside him, but he could only casually grab the most precious ones along the way. He couldn't collect all of them at all, and he couldn't slow down in the slightest to avoid being left behind by his master. How torturous was this experience for him? One can imagine. When Luo Fan finally stopped, Bai Yuan actually felt a little exhausted. He even broke out in a cold sweat. Luo Fan didn't pay too much attention to Bai Yuan. His attention was currently placed on the small tree in front of him. It had a diameter of more than 300 meters and was nearly 10,000 meters tall. This tree had already borne fruit. There were many strange disc-shaped fruits hanging densely on it. Each of these fruits was at least the size of a human head. The larger ones were even several feet in diameter. One would need to use both hands to hug them. Each of these fruits was emitting countless fine lights. The colors of these lights were all different. Some were green and messy, while others were bright red and pure. Even creatures who didn't know what kind of tree it was could instantly tell which ones were mature, which ones still needed to continue growing. Bai Yuan used his powerful willpower to pull his attention away from the exotic flowers and herbs around him and shifted it to the tree in front of him. He shifted his attention to the fruits on the tree. With this look, he instantly threw all the exotic flowers and herbs he had seen to the back of his mind. This is the wisdom tree. Bai Yuan muttered in a voice filled with disbelief and hesitation. He had never come to the eternal forest before, and he had never left the mountain where he was born, but that didn't mean he was ignorant. He had heard many legends about the great heaven and earth, so he had a strong understanding of them. The wisdom tree was a strange tree he had heard of in the legends. In the legends, the wisdom tree was the most precious gift given to living beings by the world. It bloomed once every 100,000 years and bore fruit once every 100,000 years. Only after another 100,000 years could it truly mature. This speed of bearing fruit could not be considered the longest in the great heaven and earth, but it had a wonderful use. It was what all living beings wanted the most. Therefore, the preciousness of the wisdom tree could be compared to the divine tree. It was precisely because of this degree of preciousness that the number of wisdom trees circulating outside the great Tianyuan world became fewer and fewer over the endless years. In the end, it became a legendary object. The reason why the wisdom tree was precious was because of the fruit it bore. The fruit the wisdom tree bore was the wisdom fruit, an incomparably mysterious fruit. During the growth of the wisdom fruit, it could continuously draw in the laws, and even the great Tao from the outside world. Although it couldn't stop them, it could leave traces of them in the fruit. If a living being could refine the wisdom fruit into their spirit, they could directly obtain traces of the laws, and even the great Tao. It would make it much easier for them to comprehend the laws, and great Tao. It could be said that as long as the wisdom fruit was refined into their spirit, any living being would have the results of a completely focused cultivation genius for 300,000 years. After all, the wisdom tree did not have the will of a cultivator and did not have any distracting thoughts. The growth of the wisdom fruit was naturally drawing in the laws, and great Tao from the outside world to leave traces within it. There were no distracting thoughts or subjective will, so its efficiency was no different from a completely focused cultivation genius. Even the stupidest person could imagine how great the results of a cultivation genius with no distractions would be after 300,000 years of cultivation. As such, it could be said that even the stupidest living being with the worst aptitude could easily break through the mortal realm and reach the immortal realm after obtaining the wisdom fruit. If they were a little luckier and the environment in which the wisdom fruit grew and was a little better, it would not be impossible for them to break through a few more levels on this foundation. The wisdom tree had such a wonderful effect, so it was easy to imagine how significant it was to cultivators. Its preciousness could be imagined. It was precisely because the wisdom tree was so precious that Ba Yuan did not dare to believe that such a wisdom tree would appear out of nowhere. Moreover, looking at the light emitted by the fruits on the tree, there was actually an unknown number of wisdom fruits that had already ripened. This was basically a clear indication of one's cultivation realm. How could he be so easily certain? This is obviously the wisdom tree. Luo Fan smiled and said. He had heard everything he knew about the great heaven primordial world from the human sovereign in the chaos world. After such a long time, he had naturally heard about the legends of the wisdom tree. As such, when he first saw this tree, he was almost certain that it was the wisdom tree. After coming here, he even removed the two words and was completely convinced that this was the incomparably precious wisdom tree that had endless wondrous effect for cultivators. Chapter 775. Hearing Luo Fan's confirmation, Ba Yuan's breathing instantly became much heavier. His eyes emitted an incomparably greedy glow as he stared intently at the fruits in front of him that were emitting various rays of light. Even his body trembled slightly, appearing to be doing his best to suppress his desire to pounce forward and pluck those fruits. Words first appeared. Obtaining these wisdom fruits was equivalent to obtaining the cultivation achievements of a genius cultivator in 300,000 years. Even if it was more significant to a mortal realm cultivator, it was still extremely beneficial to a celestial realm cultivator. This was especially so for Ba Yuan, who urgently needed to comprehend the mysteries of the Grand Tao. If he was lucky, a wisdom fruit might be able to raise his cultivation to the peak of the third stage of the celestial realm. It would not be impossible for him to break through to the fourth stage. It was precisely because of this that Ba Yuan was so eager and greedy. If you want it, you could take it yourself. However, this fruit was formed in the eternal forest. It's hard to say how much it will be useful in the outside world. You just have to judge for yourself. Luo Fan naturally saw through Ba Yuan's mentality and said with a smile. Ba Yuan was stunned when he heard this. The greed in his eyes lessened, and his body stopped trembling. He hesitated for a moment before he bowed and said, Master, may I ask if the cultivation realm raised by refining the wisdom fruit will regress after leaving the eternal forest? That won't happen. The cultivation realm is the sublimation of life. Once it is reached, it will not regress because of the change in location. At most, the power that can be unleashed will be reduced. Luo Fan said with a smile. Even if one's cultivation realm was achieved in another world, it would not regress after arriving in a completely different world. It was just like what Luo Fan had encountered in the untainted world, the cultivator who had reached the peak of the Daoyuo metal path from the Jili world. Although he had come to a world that was completely different from the world he grew up in, he was still at the peak of the Daoyuo Metal Path 814. However, he was not familiar with the supreme Grand Tao of the untainted world. As a result, the power it could unleash was rather limited. The two worlds separated by endless space were like this, not to mention the fact that the eternal forest was not completely separated from the heaven origin world. It was like a perfect world with the heaven origin world. Of course, it was even more impossible for Ba Yuan's cultivation level to fall again in this forest. Ba Yuan heaved a sigh of relief. After thanking Luo Fan, he began to pick out the wisdom fruits on the wisdom tree. As long as he didn't lower his cultivation level and only affected the power he could unleash, then to Ba Yuan, it wasn't much at all. To him, it was difficult to raise his cultivation level. To raise the power of his own divine art when he had enough cultivation level, that wasn't easy. But it wasn't big. Although the many wisdom fruits in front of him were born by the same wisdom tree, it was clear from the light they emitted that each wisdom fruit was different. In fact, that was the case. Just like how there wouldn't be two identical leaves on a tree, there wouldn't be two identical wisdom fruits on a wisdom tree. The reason it was like this was because when these wisdom fruits were still buds, they were all different. Therefore, the rules, laws, and even the Grand Tao were all different. And these differences, after 300,000 years of refinement, it would make these wisdom fruits completely different. It would make each wisdom fruit unique, making each wisdom fruit have its own emphasis. It would make the life form that obtained each wisdom fruit obtain a special cultivation experience. It would make each wisdom fruit unique, making each wisdom fruit have its own emphasis. There was no difference in the quality of these wisdom fruits, and there was no difference in their value. But for a cultivator, each wisdom fruit had a different value to them. Some of them were incomparably important to a cultivator, incomparably precious, enough to make their cultivation path 1,000 times smoother. There were some that were only average, only giving them some experience and some harvests. Bai Yuan had never seen a wisdom tree before and had never refined a wisdom fruit. However, Du still knew this kind of common sense very well. He stood under the tree and quietly sensed the wisdom fruits on the tree, searching for the fruit that was most compatible with him and made him feel the most comfortable, because it was refined into a spirit. Normally, a cultivator could only refine one wisdom fruit. In other words, they only had one chance to choose. If they missed it, no matter how good the wisdom fruit was in front of them in the future, they could only look at it and would not be able to change the outcome. Luo Fan didn't pay attention to Bai Yuan. His attention was currently focused on the surroundings of the wisdom tree. The wisdom tree was a wondrous tree. It was a wondrous treasure that was hidden by many forces and sages. Luo Fan was naturally very interested in everything about it, including the environment where the wisdom tree grew. At this moment, a wondrous fluctuation suddenly appeared on the wisdom tree. This fluctuation was extremely subtle and mysterious. It was faintly discernible, but it caused endless laws, and even the great Tao to resonate. It caused the space within a few kilometers to undergo a mysterious change. There seemed to be wondrous syllables constantly flashing, interweaving into an indescribable sound of Tao. All living beings who heard this sound felt their spirit become pure and clear, and their connection with the great Tao became closer and closer. As soon as Luo Fan sensed this change, he roughly understood what was going on. He shifted his attention from the surroundings of the wisdom tree to the wisdom tree. In an instant, he locked onto the source of the fluctuation. It was a wisdom fruit that was 9 feet in diameter. It was bright red and clear like the sky at sunset. Within the fluctuation, the wisdom fruit slowly separated from the wisdom tree and rose up. Bright red and clear light became brighter and brighter, becoming more and more dazzling, and the area it covered became wider and wider. Although the light became brighter and more dazzling, it became more and more illusory. It was as if it had gradually fused with the surrounding environment, gradually becoming part of the surrounding void. Brightness and dazzling light shouldn't be able to coexist with the illusory, but at this moment, they seemed to be one and couldn't be separated, constantly extending towards each other's limits. What a pity! If I had been a step earlier, I would have been able to obtain one of the most ripe wisdom fruits. Looking at this scene, even Bai Yuan understood what was going on. He could not help but feel extremely regretful. It was the transformation of the fruit of wisdom. It was clear that it had already matured to the extreme, like a melon falling off a stalk when it was ripe, breaking free from the wisdom tree. From the looks of it, after the wisdom fruit was separated from the wisdom tree, it had directly melted into the void, fusing with the surrounding laws, nomological laws, and even the great Tao. It was obtained from the world and returned to the world. It could no longer be refined by cultivators. When these wisdom fruits entered the surroundings, they wouldn't have much effect on the laws, and Grand Tao, but they could make the laws, and Grand Tao more stable. It became even harder to cut and destroy. It was repaying the blessing that the world had bestowed upon it for 300,000 years. If that's the case, no wonder I haven't seen any traces of the wisdom fruit underground, even though so many wisdom fruits have ripened, Luo Fan thought. He took a step forward and instantly arrived next to the wisdom fruit that was merging with the world. When the wisdom fruit merged with the world, it had already fused with the world, becoming illusory yet real. Ordinary cultivators wouldn't be able to touch the illusory yet real state. However, to Luo Fan, this illusory yet real state didn't hinder him at all. He stretched out his hand and easily touched the wisdom fruit that was constantly changing. It felt extremely comfortable to touch, as if he was touching the most wonderful thing in the world. The fruit faintly vibrated in a mysterious manner. Endless profound principles interweaved and moved within it, weaving endless mysteries. When the fruit merged with the world, it was also when the connection between the world and the fruit was the closest. At this moment, the entire world opened up to the fruit. If he could sense all the changes in the fruit in this instant, he would be able to comprehend the endless mysteries of the world. That kind of harvest, it might even be greater than directly refining the fruit into a spirit soul. However, a cultivator who could truly achieve this step had to be at least a perfected heavenly immortal realm cultivator. In other words, a cultivator in the upper 3 ranks of the immortal realm. For a cultivator at that level, they would be able to obtain the same harvest in a few months of cultivation, so the wisdom fruit naturally wouldn't be of much use to them. Thus, unless they had a special purpose, they wouldn't make such an unnecessary move. And Luo Fan clearly had a special purpose at this moment. Everything in the Eternal Forest was very interesting to him, but he was eager to understand everything about the Eternal Forest. The rules and laws were naturally included in it. It would naturally be best if he could save a few months of time through the changes in the wisdom fruit. Ba Yuan looked at Luo Fan's actions, but he could only feel envy in his heart. He could only imagine the power of that kind of divine ability, but he couldn't do it. With a sigh, he still focused his attention on the wisdom fruit on the tree, no longer caring about the changes in the wisdom fruit that was merging with the world. With a slight thought, the heart fire in his heart instantly surged and wrapped around his entire body. It made him look like he had turned into a flaming man standing under the tree. The heart fire was a kind of power that was close to idealism. As long as he was willing, it naturally wouldn't produce any heat and wouldn't affect his surroundings in the slightest. Thus, even the weeds on the ground and the extremely few fallen leaves weren't ignited by the heart fire's appearance. Instead, it was as if the heart fire was just an illusory light. Although it covered them, it didn't cause any changes. The heart fire swayed slightly, and faint fluctuations constantly spread in all directions. These fluctuations were extremely mysterious and subtle. They contained all the characteristics of a heart fire, and they constantly searched everywhere for existences that could resonate with it. The wisdom tree was naturally enveloped by the fluctuations of the heart fire. Amidst the fluctuations, the densely packed wisdom fruits also underwent all sorts of subtle changes. Almost every fruit of wisdom produced a fluctuation. However, these fluctuations varied in strength. Some were almost undetectable, while others were extremely obvious. The more obvious the fluctuations were, the more compatible the laws, and even the Tao imprinted in the fruit were with the heart fire. Of course, this wasn't the only reference for Ba Yuan's choice. After all, the heart fire was only his power and didn't completely represent Ba Yuan. However, this was an extremely important reference. After all, to Ba Yuan, the heart fire was astonishingly important to him. Combining the feelings of his soul, Ba Yuan finally locked his gaze on a wisdom fruit. This wisdom fruit was nearly 9 feet in diameter. It was slightly different from the wisdom fruit that was merging with the world. Evidently, it was a fruit that was about to fully mature and merge with the world. The light that this wisdom fruit gave off was extremely pure. Within the bright red and clear light, there was a hint of yellow. This was the fluctuation caused by the fluctuations of the heart fire. In other words, although the resonance with the heart fire was strong and obvious, it wasn't the strongest or most obvious of all the wisdom fruits. However, it was the most compatible with Ba Yuan's soul. After choosing this wisdom fruit, Bai Yuan retracted his heart fire and stepped into the air. In just a few steps, he crossed a height of several thousand feet and arrived next to the wisdom fruit. There weren't too many taboos when picking the wisdom fruit. It wasn't as fragile as the legendary ginseng fruit. Hence, Bai Yuan raised his hand and pointed. An invisible force wrapped around the wisdom fruit. With a violent shake, the connection between the wisdom fruit and the wisdom tree was severed. At this moment, the entire wisdom tree trembled slightly. Waves of mysterious power flashed from various parts of the wisdom tree and quickly gathered towards this branch. In an instant, a small ball of light condensed at the cut. This ball of light was illusory, but there seemed to be a solid substance brewing and evolving within it. When Bai Yuan saw this, he came to a sudden realization. He understood that this was a new cycle of blossoming, bearing fruit, and maturing. However, this didn't mean anything to him anymore. He carefully picked up the wisdom fruit and returned to the wisdom tree. When he raised his head, he saw Luo Fan with his eyes closed. He raised his hand to touch the wisdom fruit that was gradually fusing with the world and the void. His aura was restrained. It was as if he had completely fused with the wisdom fruit. There seemed to be no gap between him and the world around him. Looking at Luo Fan, Bai Yuan's eyes were still filled with indescribable envy. After a long time, he sighed and carefully released his heart fire. It formed a small array around him. As the light and shadow flickered, his figure disappeared. He knew that this wasn't his territory and needed to be carefully defended. Hence, he set up this defense. After setting up the defense, he wrapped his heart fire around the wisdom fruit. It constantly nourished and seeped into the wisdom fruit, slowly invading its interior. Waves of information that couldn't be described with words poured into his mind and mind like a flood. They attacked his soul and his mind. This information was extremely profound. It contained countless truths of the world, countless traces of rules and laws, and even a shadow of the great Tao. While immersed in this information, Bai Yuan completely forgot about the outside world. He could only control his heart flame to constantly invade the fruit of wisdom, while his mind soared through the boundless information. As his heart fire invaded, the wisdom fruit gradually turned into nothingness and shrank. It gradually fused with the heart fire and entered his body. As the heart fire circulated, it gradually entered his soul. During this process, time passed. In the blink of an eye, several days had passed. At this moment, Bai Yuan's body shook and he returned from the endless information. He opened his eyes and found that the wisdom fruit had disappeared without him noticing, and his heart fire had returned to his body, once again occupying his heart. Clearly, he had refined the wisdom fruit. A sense of loss rose from his heart in an instant. He sighed, knowing that it would be difficult to obtain the incomparably wonderful feeling he had with her again. He raised his hand and withdrew the heart fire that had set up a formation around him. He then reappeared under the wisdom tree. He looked up and saw his master still floating in the air. He raised his hand and touched the wisdom fruit that was merging with the world. As for the wisdom fruit, PGT, Shoubai, Shushanhuanshi, Tickle White Cherry, 73 Falcon Blowing Tomb, Luo, Forbin, Looking for a Quarrel, Pool Hazel Pond, Sowing Neck Brook Dream Varen, Play, Sullen Coal Fate Alliance, Cut Huanfong Hazel, Meimu Yen Wink, Alliance Pu Huang Jiang, Falcon Blowing Sack Luo Ko, PGT. It was obvious that after several days, the process of the wisdom fruit merging with the world was nearing its end. An indescribable sense of envy appeared in Bai Yuan's eyes again. His gains in these few days were naturally enormous. Through refining the fruit of wisdom and comprehending the information contained within it, even though his cultivation hadn't increased by much, he'd broken through and eliminated all the obstacles to the peak of the third level of the immortal realm. After that, as long as he spent some time cultivating, accumulating the heart fire, and increasing his strength, it would only take a few years for him to reach the peak of the third order of the immortal realm. Compared to the tens of thousands of years he needed to cultivate to achieve the same goal, this was already a huge gain. It It was enough to make him ecstatic. However, he knew that if he could sense the entire process of the wisdom fruit merging with the world like his master, his gains would definitely be 1,000 times greater. At the very least, he would be able to break through all the obstacles to the fourth order of the immortal realm. The difference between the third order of the immortal realm and the fourth order of the immortal realm was like the difference between the lower order and the middle order. The difference was many times greater than the difference between the first order and the second order. Normally, even if it took 1,000,000 years to break through the bottleneck of the third order of the immortal realm, it would be considered extremely fast. How could he not be envious? However, it was obvious that he could only be envious. The power of Luo Fan's divine art was not something he could compare to. No matter how envious he was, before he reached the upper order of the immortal realm, he would never be able to do that. Chapter 776. The fruit of wisdom remained in the world for 9 days and 9 nights. By the time the wisdom had completely disappeared into the heavens and earth, Bai Yuan had already stayed under the tree for several days. When the fruit of wisdom began to merge into the world, the fruit of wisdom finally disappeared without a trace. The bright and dazzling light emitted by the fruit of wisdom also disappeared at the same time, as if it had never appeared. At this time, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes that had been closed for 9 days and 9 nights. A vast forest flashed in his eyes, as if the entire eternal forest had been absorbed into his mind. I didn't expect the rules and laws to be changed in this way. Luo Fan let out a long breath. The 815th path of creation moved slightly, and he said, "Friend, you've been watching for so long. It should be enough. Why don't you show yourself?" Bai Yuan had been paying attention to Luo Fan. When he saw Luo Fan wake up, he felt relieved. Hearing this, he couldn't help but be shocked. The heart fire in his body trembled, and in an instant, he turned into a man of fire. His eyes swept around, vigilantly checking the surroundings. "Sure enough, I've been discovered by you. Someone who can interfere with the fruit of wisdom is indeed not simple." A leisurely and hoarse voice sounded out of nowhere. It was like a cool breeze that surrounded the surroundings, making Bai Yuan feel as if his body had been restrained by an indescribable power in an instant, and he was almost unable to move. This type of power is at least 3 levels higher than mine. In that instant, 8 elements had a rough estimate of the cultivation level of the person who spoke these words, and this understanding made him instantly incomparably nervous. The heart fire directly condensed around his body, turning into a circular shape that stretched and contracted like a beating heart. The shape was somewhat similar to the fruit of wisdom, but there were countless complex and mysterious symbols engraved on it, containing all kinds of unfathomable mysteries. It emitted an aura of the 815th path of creation that was as stable as a mountain. This was something he had gained from comprehending the information contained within the fruit of wisdom. The heart fire was a kind of power that was close to idealism. Once it was formed, he could control it as he wished. However, this did not mean that he could unleash all the power of the heart flame the moment it was formed. Just like how a normal person could handle a sword, a normal person could easily pick up a sword and even make the sword move as they wished. But that did not mean that they could display the power of the sword to its limit. The heart fire was the same. Although Bai Yuan could control the heart fire at the moment it was formed, he didn't know how to construct the heart fire in order to fully display its power. This disc formed by the heart fire was a method of constructing the heart fire. This construction method contained some laws of the eternal forest. Once it was formed, it would have an indescribable defensive power, almost completely isolating it from the outside world. It allowed him to form a body of his own, completely immune to all material and energy attacks from the outside world. Bai Yuan knew very well that although he had reached the peak of the 3rd stage of the celestial realm, it was just a realm. Even if his cultivation reached the peak of the 3rd stage of the celestial realm, he was still as weak as an ant compared to someone at the 6th stage of the celestial realm. Moreover, he had only reached the peak of the 3rd stage of the celestial realm. His cultivation had yet to catch up with his realm. As such, The only thing he could do in the face of such an existence was, there was only one point, and that was to defend oneself first. Just as Ba Yuan was about to condense the heart flame into the disk, a soft exclamation came out of nowhere. Your servant is quite smart. I didn't expect you to be able to digest the wisdom fruit so quickly. It's just that I've wasted too much time previously. This is the first time I've come into contact with such a wondrous technique. That's why I've been able to absorb it so quickly. Luo Fan glanced at Ba Yuan and said indifferently. At this moment, a vast will began to condense in the void in front of Luo Fan. This was extremely powerful. It was at least the will of a 7th-stage celestial, and it was a 7th-stage celestial of the middle 3 stages. That will contain a dense life force, as well as an extremely ancient aura. Friend, you must have just entered the eternal forest from the outside world. After the will condensed into a figure, it said to Luo Fan. Luo Fan was slightly taken aback when he saw the figure of the will. Then, he revealed a look of understanding. The figure of the will was the great Tian Yuan world's born Taoist aptitude. Just like Luo Fan's figure, it had the appearance of a hairless gorilla. It had the appearance of a middle-aged man with a peaceful face. There was a deep light of wisdom in his eyes. Although the body formed by the will was a little illusory, it gave off an indestructible aura. That's right. I'm Luo Fan. How should I address you, friend? Luo Fan did not sense the will's malice, so he was willing to communicate with it. The will chuckled and said, as expected, I'm the beak coffin. I've been in the eternal forest for more than 300 million years. I'm really happy to see fellow Luo Fan today. I wonder if I can have the honor of inviting you to my cave abode? I couldn't ask for more. Luo Fan also smiled when he heard that. In fact, when Luo Fan first arrived at the location of the wisdom tree, he had vaguely felt that there was an intent paying attention to this place. It was just that the intent was extremely compatible with the surrounding world, so it was extremely obscure and difficult to detect. As a result, he was unable to confirm where the intent came from. More importantly, the will only seemed to be paying attention to the wisdom tree and did not have any malice towards him. That was why he did not have much of a reaction and did not say anything. Only when he completed all of his objectives in the wisdom tree did the will still pay attention to this place. Only then did he become interested in the will's existence, which was why he replied to it. After knowing that the beak coffin had entered the eternal forest from the outside world and had stayed in the eternal forest for more than 300 million years, he was naturally even more interested in it. That was why he agreed to its invitation without any hesitation. Of course, the most important reason was that although the beak coffin's cultivation was high, it was not as powerful as his current body. If they were to fight, he had absolute confidence that he could escape. In this situation, he naturally had nothing to fear. Hearing Luo Fan agree, the beak coffin was overjoyed. It said with a smile, "Fellow Luo Fan, please come this way." As it spoke, it flew off in a certain direction. It was not fast, but it was not slow either. It constantly shuttled back and forth along the way, passing through area after area of the wondrous trees. It flew towards a place 1,000 miles away from the wisdom tree, deep into the eternal forest. With the power of Luo Fan's abilities, even if the beak coffin's speed increased by 1,000 times, he would not feel any strain. He wouldn't feel any strain at all, so he naturally wouldn't fall behind at this moment. When Ba Yuan saw Luo Fan move, he put away his heart flame. His body trembled, and he flew up, quickly chasing after Luo Fan and the will of the beak coffin. Because the two of them did not increase their speed too much, Ba Yuan was able to easily follow behind them. 1,000 miles was not a problem for them, even if they flew at a moderate speed. It only took them a few breaths of time. In such a short period of time, it was impossible for Luo Fan and the beak coffin to communicate too much. As a result, they remained silent the entire way. The beak outer coffin's destination was a tree with a diameter of 300 meters. It was a tree with a diameter of 300 meters, but it was only around 30,000 meters tall. The branches and leaves of this tree were extremely lush, and the leaves were extremely fine. They completely covered the ground within a radius of tens of thousands of feet. On the ground, there was even a small pond that surrounded the tree, making it seem like the tree was growing in the pond. Other than the tree, there were also many strange flowers and plants around the pond, making it look very beautiful. It would make people feel a sense of tranquility and joy. At this moment, there was a middle-aged man standing next to the pond with a chuckle. The man's appearance was exactly the same as the will, so he was clearly the body of the beak coffin. After the will of the beak coffin arrived here, without any hesitation, it pounced into the middle-aged man's body, and the two of them directly became one. Following this, the middle-aged man's eyes shined brighter, and the aura he gave off became stronger. Because this one's body is tied to something, it is difficult for me to leave this place, so I can only travel with my will. Please forgive me for my rudeness, fellow Taoist. The beak coffin bowed to Luo Fan, feeling very ashamed. What's wrong with that? For a living being, what's the difference between a body and a will? Luo Fan smiled and waved his hand. The beak coffin seemed to heave a sigh of relief and said, I establish my abode on the tree. Please follow me, fellow Taoist. Please. Luo Fan naturally had no objections. He was quite curious about the beak coffin's abode anyway. The beak coffin turned around and pointed at the tree. A spot of profound light that was as clear as water gradually lit up at the top of the tree, then suddenly condensed into a path of light that extended towards them. In the blink of an eye, it laid out before them. This tree has been refined by this one for hundreds of millions of years. It has already formed its own space-time, forming an extremely tight defense. Without this path of light, even I would find it difficult to go within 100,000 meters of it, the beak coffin said with some embarrassment. So that's how it is. Fellow Taoist, your abilities are truly profound to be able to refine such a mysterious space-time, Luo Fan praised. It was not difficult to refine a tree into its own space-time, and Luo Fan could easily do it. He did not even need to spend a lot of time. As long as he counted the days, he would be able to do it in a few years. However, to refine the space-time to the point where even he could not enter or leave it, he had to rely on some special channels to enter and exit. This required a lot of effort. Of course, this was not a kind of degeneration, nor was it a failure. Instead, it meant that the laws of the space-time had reached an unimaginably tight and complicated state. It was even possible that they were constantly changing to the point where he could not completely comprehend them in a short period of time, nor could he completely grasp their rules. That was the only way such a result could be achieved. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan exclaimed in admiration. The beak coffin naturally understood Luo Fan's intentions. When it heard his words, it looked delighted, but said that it was only a small path. The three of them stepped onto the path of light together. In an instant, space-time flowed. It was as if they had passed through endless space-time in the blink of an eye. Countless shadows flashed before them. This change was not unacceptable to Luo Fan and the beak coffin. They had long since expected it. But to 8 Origin Root, this was an unimaginably mysterious experience. In that instant, he felt as if his heart was about to stop, and his eyes were wide open. His eyes widened in shock. Opening up space to store matter was something that even a first-stage immortal could easily do. However, opening up space-time and refining an object into its own space-time wasn't something an ordinary immortal could do. At the very least, 8 Origin Root could not do it. In fact, he did not even know how powerful he had to be in order to do it. Under these circumstances, when had he ever truly experienced the space-time of the outside world? How had he ever enjoyed the wonders of traveling through space-time? To him, the changes in space-time before him were like the first time the heavens and earth had been split apart. For a moment, he felt as if he were a mortal witnessing the methods of an immortal for the first time. His heart reverberated with the feeling of insignificance. The sliver of arrogance that had arisen from his rapid rise in cultivation finally disappeared without a trace. His mentality returned to its previous state of extreme humility. Luo Fan carefully sensed the changes in space-time. He discovered that ever since he stepped onto the path of light, he had entered a completely new place. The flow of time in this new place was slightly out of sync with the flow of time before he stepped onto the path of light. There wasn't much of this difference. It was only an insignificant change. In fact, it was impossible to accurately distinguish the changes inside and outside using precise numbers. However, it was this difference that truly separated the space-time inside and outside. This allowed the space-time inside to truly exist in the outside world. When the changes in light and shadow completely subsided, the surrounding light and shadow stabilized once more. The few of them had already appeared in a brand new world. This was a brand new world. This world was extremely mysterious. In the middle of this world, there was an incomparably huge tree. Even a 1 million meter tall giant tree looked like an ant in front of it. This giant tree was rooted in a boundless ocean. This ocean was dotted with countless huge islands. Each of these islands was in the shape of some kind of exotic flowers and plants. However, there were countless weak auras of living beings on them. Clearly, there were countless living beings living on these islands. Apart from this, there were countless vitality circulating and brewing in the ocean. Clearly, there were also countless living beings living in it. Above the entire world was a boundless layer of clouds. This layer of clouds appeared on the main trunk of the giant tree, completely covering the branches and leaves above. All living beings could only see the clouds when they looked up at the sky. They couldn't see anything above the clouds. There was a huge ball of light in this layer of clouds. It was constantly moving according to some mysterious law. It shone on a certain area of this world in a continuous cycle. The area that was illuminated by it was daytime. The areas that weren't illuminated were nighttime. Thus, every area was alternating between day and night. At this moment, the path of light that Luo Fan, the beak coffin, and Bai Yuan were on was below the sea of clouds. It pierced into the depths of the sea of clouds, heading straight for the giant tree in the middle. Even Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh in admiration. Bai Yuan felt like he was witnessing a miracle. He had never felt so ignorant and ill-informed before. He actually created a world, this kind of divine ability, this kind of power. Is this really something an immortal can do? Has this person already become a saint? This was the only thought in Bai Yuan's mind at this moment. Luo Fan and the beak coffin naturally didn't care about Bai Yuan's shock. The beak coffin only paid attention to Luo Fan. Bai Yuan was only a third-stage immortal. With this kind of cultivation, he might be able to live comfortably in the inner regions of the great Tianyuan world and could even live safely in the outer regions. However, in the eyes of a seventh-stage immortal like him, he was nothing but an ant. The only reason Bai Yuan paid him any attention was because he was Luo Fan's servant. Why would he pay attention to what Bai Yuan was thinking? So, fellow Taoist, is comprehending the way of creation. No wonder you've stayed here for hundreds of millions of years, praised Luo Fan with a smile. When the beak coffin heard Luo Fan's words, it felt like it had found a confidant. It laughed heartily. As expected, I can't hide it from fellow Taoist. All the living things in this space-time were created by me by combining many strange beasts over the past hundreds of millions of years. It's already been 12 generations, but it's allowed me to comprehend a sliver of the way of creation and reach the peak of the 7th rank. When Luo Fan heard the beak coffin's words, he instantly understood what it meant. In fact, when he sensed the auras of the living things in the space-time, he guessed that these living things must have been created by the beak coffin itself and not moved in from the great heaven primal world. This was because although these living things looked very similar to the natural Tao aptitude of the great heaven primal world, and they also looked like hairless gorillas, their quality was very different from the living things of the great heaven primal world. Their bloodlines contained the auras of many other strange beasts, as if they were all created by combining other strange beasts through various unimaginable and mysterious methods. It was precisely because they were created from many strange beasts that their bloodlines contained the auras of many strange beasts. At the same time, they also possessed the talents of many strange beasts. If they cultivated, it would be even easier and faster for them than the living things of the great heaven primal world and the outside world. Of course, there were bound to be some drawbacks. However, for the time being, Luo Fan could not figure out what those drawbacks were.